Hey hey. Welcome back to Arcane Paradox. We've got something fire today. What if Harry triggered a parental protection clause in the Potter will and got the Dursleys imprisoned? Likes and subs keep us going. Alright, story time. Chapter 1, the clause awakens. The cupboard under the stairs at number 4, Privet Drive measured 4 feet wide and 6 feet long. Harry knew this because he had counted the floorboards 312 times. He knew other things too. He knew that the hot water pipe running along the left wall made the space almost unbearable in July, and almost tolerable in January. He knew that if he pressed his ear to the thin partition wall at exactly the right angle, he could hear the television in the sitting room, the low drone of it, the canned laughter, the way it went silent when Vernon fell asleep in his chair, which meant Harry needed to stop moving entirely until the snoring started. He knew that Dudley had broken the lock on the cupboard door twice trying to get at him, and both times Uncle Vernon had fixed it and told Dudley not to bother. Not because he cared, but because locked was more useful than broken. Harry was 7 years old, and he was very good at knowing things quietly. The summer had been a bad one. Dudley's birthday had come and gone in a wave of presents and cake and a trip to the zoo that Harry had not been invited on, which was fine, except that Mrs. Figg had been unavailable and so Harry had been left at number 4 alone for 8 hours with nothing to eat and instructions from Vernon not to touch anything. He hadn't. He'd sat on the kitchen floor because the kitchen floor was the only room without carpet, and he'd thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill he developed specifically for days like that. The bad part had started 2 days later. Dudley had come back from school with a bruise on his arm and a story about a boy in his class who had pushed him, and the story had grown in the telling until it was practically an assault, and Vernon had looked at Harry across the dinner table. Harry ate at the corner of the table, slightly apart, on the understanding that he was being allowed a privilege, and said, "Friends of yours?" Harry didn't have friends. Vernon knew that. "No, sir," Harry said. Vernon had looked at him for a long moment. "Don't get smart with me, boy." Harry hadn't said anything. He'd learned very young that saying nothing was different from being quiet, and that Vernon could hear the difference, and that sometimes even saying nothing was enough. That night, Vernon had come to the cupboard. It wasn't the first time. There had been other nights, mostly when the drinking had been heavy, mostly when something at work had gone wrong, mostly when Harry had done something small and visible that could be pointed to as the cause of all difficulties. Vernon liked causes. He liked to be able to say because. It made the thing that followed feel justified, at least to Vernon. This time the because was that Harry had looked at him wrong. Harry had apparently looked at him wrong during dinner, and this had been stewing for hours, and now it was past 11 and the house was dark and Vernon was standing in the doorway of the cupboard with his belt in his hand and his face the particular shade of deep red that meant he had crossed from angry into something else. "Dad said you've been acting up," Dudley had told Harry that afternoon, with the satisfied cruelty of a child who understood the machinery of the house even if he didn't understand why it worked the way it did. "He said he's going to sort you out." Harry had not slept. He'd sat on his cot in the dark and breathed and counted the floorboards and tried to make himself as small as possible, which he was good at, but smallness hadn't always been enough. Vernon hit him twice before it happened. The second blow caught Harry across the shoulder and knocked him sideways into the wall, and something, a feeling he'd had before but never this sharp, never this sudden, like a string pulled taut and then released, cracked open in his chest, and the air in the cupboard changed. The single bare bulb in the hallway exploded. The belt in Vernon's hand snapped in half with a sound like a gunshot. Every window in number 4, Privet Drive rattled in its frame simultaneously, a single resonant shudder, as if the house itself had flinched. Vernon stumbled backward into the hallway. In the sudden darkness, Harry could hear him breathing, ragged, shocked, a sound Harry had never heard Vernon make before. Something close to fear. Petunia's voice floated down from upstairs, sharp and alarmed, "Vernon. Vernon, what was that?" Vernon did not answer. He stood in the hallway with the 2 useless halves of his belt and looked at the cupboard door, which had swung shut on its own, and did not come back. Harry sat in the dark with his back against the wall and his shoulder aching and waited. He didn't know what he'd done. He knew it had come from him. Things like this had happened before, smaller things, stranger things, a teacher's hair turning blue once when she'd been particularly cruel, a sweater Petunia had forced him into shrinking down to nothing overnight, Dudley's gang cornering him behind the bins one afternoon and Harry somehow ending up on the school roof with no memory of climbing. Things that couldn't be explained and therefore were never explained, just punished after the fact, because Vernon had decided somewhere along the way that whatever was wrong with the boy was the boy's fault. But this had been different. This had felt like something answering. Not him doing, something responding, as though it had been waiting for exactly this moment and exactly this threshold and had been ready. Harry pulled his knees to his chest and closed his eyes. His shoulder hurt badly. He breathed through it. He did not cry. He had mostly stopped crying around age 5. He was asleep before he knew it, the way children who are very tired and a little in shock sometimes fall asleep, suddenly, completely, without transition. He did not hear the owl arrive at 2:30 in the morning. He did not hear it rap its beak against Petunia's kitchen window with the precise, insistent rhythm of official correspondence. He did not hear Petunia, white-faced and shaking, read the letter it carried, or hear the small, strangled sound she made, somewhere between a gasp and a word she couldn't finish. He did not hear her wake Vernon with a voice stripped of everything except urgency, and he did not hear Vernon read the letter, and he did not hear the silence that followed, thick and loaded and entirely unlike any silence number 4 had produced before. What woke Harry was the knock at the front door. It was 6:47 in the morning. He knew because the strip of light coming under the cupboard door was the particular pale gold of very early summer sun, and he could hear pigeons on the roof, which only happened before 7. He'd learned to read the house by its sounds. The knock came again. Not a polite knock. A knock that was not asking. He heard Vernon's heavy footsteps on the stairs, the creak of the third step that always sounded like a protest. Heard the chain on the front door, the deadbolt. Heard the door open. Then he heard a voice he didn't recognize, low, precise, with an accent he couldn't place and a tone that brooked absolutely nothing, say, "Mr. Vernon Dursley. I am Solicitor Arcturus Greenfeld, representing the estate of Lord James Charles Potter and Lady Lily Evangeline Potter. I have with me a representative of Gringotts Wizarding Bank. We are here under the authority of Clause 14 of the Potter family will, specifically the Parental Protection provision, which was triggered at 11:43 last night. You will let us in." A pause. Vernon said, "I don't know what you're, Mr. Dursley." The voice had not changed in pitch or warmth, because it had no warmth to change. "The clause has been active for 7 hours. Every minute of those 7 hours has been logged. You will let us in, or I will have this property sealed and you removed by ministry orders within the hour. Your choice is a formality. Make it quickly." Harry sat very still in his cupboard and listened to his uncle step aside. He heard them come in, 2 sets of footsteps, one measured and human, one slightly irregular, heavier than it should be, with something about the rhythm that felt off in a way Harry couldn't name. They went into the sitting room. He heard Petunia's voice, high and brittle. He heard something being set down on the coffee table, something with weight to it, something official. Then a third voice, not human, or not quite. Gravelled and deliberate and carrying a precision that made every word feel like it had been placed rather than spoken. The magical distress signature was logged at Gringotts at 23:43 hours. Under the terms of the Potter will, Clause 14, subsection 3, this constitutes a triggering event. The child is to be presented immediately. Harry heard his aunt make a sound. Vernon said, "Now look here," immediately, the goblin said, "means now." Footsteps. Coming toward the hallway. Harry scrambled to sitting position, which was the only position available, and found himself staring at the cupboard door as the latch lifted. The door opened. The man who opened it was tall, thin, and dressed in robes that managed to look expensive without looking showy, the kind of expensive that didn't need to announce itself. He had gray at his temples and eyes the color of old pewter and a face that had clearly decided decades ago that expressions were largely optional. He looked at Harry. He looked at the cupboard. He looked at the paint-peeling walls, the narrow cot, the single thin blanket, the small pile of hand-me-down clothes in the corner, the penciled height marks on the door frame where Harry had tracked his own growth because no one else had. He took all of this in without a word. Then he crouched down so he was level with Harry, a deliberate thing, unhurried, and he said, quietly, in a voice that was just for Harry, "My name is Arcturus Greenfeld. I work for your parents. I've been waiting 7 years to find you." Harry stared at him. "Can you stand?" Greenfeld asked. "I need to see your shoulder." Harry had forgotten about the shoulder. He became aware of it again, a deep, unpleasant ache that ran from the joint down to the middle of his back. He nodded and stood, ducking slightly to avoid the sloped ceiling. He was small for 7, something Dudley made a point of mentioning regularly. Greenfeld looked at his shoulder, not the shoulder, Harry realized, but the bruise blooming there, visible where his overlarge t-shirt had slipped. He said nothing. His face said nothing. But something in his posture shifted, a tiny realignment, like something settling into place. He straightened up and turned back to the hallway. "Snap chart," he said. The goblin appeared at Greenfeld's elbow so quickly and so silently that Harry pressed back against the wall before he could help it. The goblin was slightly shorter than Greenfeld and considerably broader, with a face like hammered bronze and eyes like black glass that caught the hallway light and held it. He was carrying a brass instrument roughly the size of a grapefruit, covered in small dials, all of which were spinning in different directions. The goblin held the instrument up and it made a sound, a single clear tone, and all the dials stopped at once. Snapchart looked at the instrument. Then he looked at Harry with an expression Harry couldn't read at all, because goblin faces were built for different things than human faces. "Confirmed," Snapchart said. "Triggering event verified. Distress signature genuine. The clause is active." He produced a scroll from somewhere. His robes had too many pockets and the pockets seemed larger than they should have been, and made a mark on it with a quill that wrote in something dark red. "The child is Lord Harry James Potter, sole heir to the ancient and noble house of Potter. He is in our custody as of this moment." "He is not in anyone's custody," Vernon said loudly from the sitting room doorway. His face was puce. He had the look of a man who had been frightened and was now converting the fright into aggression because aggression was the only register he had. "He is a child in my care, and you have no right to come into my home, Mr. Dursley." Greenfeld turned toward him with the unhurried certainty of someone who has never needed to raise his voice. "Your nephew is Lord Harry James Potter. He is the heir to one of the oldest wizarding families in Britain. He has been living in a cupboard. He has a bruise on his shoulder consistent with blunt force impact sustained approximately 7 hours ago. The Parental Protection Clause was placed in the Potter will by James and Lily Potter specifically to address the situation I am currently looking at." He paused, just briefly. "You are not his guardian anymore. That status was revoked at 11:43 last night. You are, currently, a person of interest in an active ministry investigation. I would strongly suggest you stop talking." The sitting room was very quiet. Petunia was sitting on the sofa with her hands folded in her lap and her face the color of old plaster. She was looking at Harry with an expression he couldn't read. Not guilt, exactly. Not grief. Something older and more complicated than either, something that lived underneath those things, and Harry, who was 7 and very perceptive, filed it away without knowing what to do with it yet. Dudley, awakened by voices, appeared at the top of the stairs in his pajamas. He took in the 2 strangers in the hallway, and the goblin, and his father's face, and his cousin standing in the doorway of the cupboard. He said, "Mum." "Go back to your room," Petunia said, in a voice that was very controlled and very empty. "Now, Dudley." Dudley went. Greenfeld looked at Harry. "Do you have anything you'd like to take with you?" Harry considered this. He looked at the cupboard, the thin blanket, the cot, the small pile of clothes that were all secondhand from Dudley and didn't fit. He had 3 books he'd found discarded at school, which he kept hidden under the mattress because Dudley had a habit of destroying things Harry valued. "Just the books," Harry said. He gathered them in 30 seconds. They were battered: a wildlife encyclopedia with half the spine missing, a library copy of Treasure Island that had been deaccessioned and clearly dropped in a puddle at some point, and a thin volume on astronomy that had no author listed. He held them in front of him like they were something. Greenfeld didn't comment on the books. He simply nodded and said, "Come on, then." Harry stepped out of the cupboard and into the hallway, and it occurred to him, with a clarity that was almost startling, that he had never walked down the hallway of number 4 without listening for footsteps first. Without calculating where everyone was. Without moving as though the air itself needed to be negotiated. He walked down the hallway and the air didn't stop him. At the front door, he paused and looked back. Vernon was standing in the sitting room doorway with his hands at his sides and his face doing something complicated and ugly. Petunia had not moved from the sofa. The house looked, in the early morning light, exactly like what it was: ordinary, clean, well-maintained, a house in which nothing unusual was supposed to happen, a house designed to be unremarkable and look after itself. Harry looked at it and did not feel sad, which surprised him slightly. He looked at Petunia. She met his eyes, and for a moment, just a moment, something in her face cracked, a hairline fracture, something that might have been the beginning of "I'm sorry" if she had been built differently. She looked away first. Harry followed Greenfeld out the front door. The street was quiet. A blackbird was singing from the oak tree 3 houses down. The morning air was clean and cool and tasted nothing like the inside of the cupboard. Parked in front of number 4 was a sleek black car with Ministry of Magic plates. They were magically hidden from Muggle sight, but Harry, for reasons he couldn't explain, could read them fine, and behind it, something that Harry had never seen outside of the occasional dream and couldn't fully account for, a second car that was clearly not quite a car. Its windows were tinted to absolute black and it sat slightly too still, the way things that are performing stillness rather than experiencing it sometimes do. Snapchart moved to the second car without a word and opened the rear door. "Gringotts transport," Greenfeld explained, appearing at Harry's shoulder. "Goblin made. Nothing gets in or out without Snapchart's key." "Where are we going?" Harry asked. It was the first thing he'd asked, and he'd asked it in the same even, unhurried tone he used for everything, because 7 years in a small space with unpredictable people had made him very good at not revealing what he needed. Greenfeld looked at him. Something in the grey eyes shifted, not softness exactly, but acknowledgement. The look of someone who recognizes something in another person. "Gringotts, first," Greenfeld said. "There's a will to be read. Then, that depends on you." "On me," Harry repeated. "The clause gives you legal standing, Harry. Not me, not the bank, not the ministry. You. Within certain limits, you direct what happens next." He paused. "I should have been clearer. I work for your parents, which means I work for you. Everything I do from this moment is on your instruction, not theirs." Harry thought about this. He looked at the Gringotts transport, at Snapchart standing beside the open door with the patience of something geological. "What about Vernon and Petunia?" Harry asked. "They'll be receiving formal notification from the ministry within the hour. They'll be required to present themselves for questioning. Whether charges follow depends on the investigation." Greenfeld's tone was measured, factual. Not cruel. Just accurate. "And there's nothing they can do to stop it?" "No," Greenfeld said, simply. Harry nodded once. He got into the car. The interior was larger than the outside, which Harry made a mental note about. The seats were dark leather and he sank into one and held his 3 books in his lap and watched number 4, Privet Drive, get smaller through a window that showed the view perfectly clearly despite being impenetrably black from outside. Snapchart settled across from him. The goblin's black glass eyes watched Harry with something that wasn't quite curiosity and wasn't quite assessment, but was somewhere between the two. "You didn't scream," Snapchart said, eventually. Harry looked at him. When the door opened. Most human children would have screamed or run. You did neither. Harry thought about that. I heard you coming, he said. I knew you weren't him. Snapchat said nothing for a moment. Then, your father came to Gringotts 3 days before he died. He updated the will. He said, the goblin stopped. Looked out the window. Whatever he'd been about to say apparently required a different approach. He said his son would know how to be still. That stillness ran in the family. He glanced back at Harry. He was right. Harry looked at his hands. They were very ordinary hands, slightly too large for his wrists, with a scar on the left palm from when he'd caught a piece of broken glass in the kitchen aged 5 and Petunia had taped it closed without taking him to hospital. He thought about his father saying that. He thought about a man who had been dead for 6 years taking the time to tell a goblin his son would know how to be still. He felt something in his chest that was not quite grief and not quite warmth but was something in the territory between them, something that didn't have a clean name. He held his books and watched London wake up through a window that only he could see through, and said nothing else for the rest of the drive. Diagon Alley was not yet open for business at 7 in the morning, but Gringotts was always open, because Gringotts kept its own time and answered to no one's schedule but its own. The white marble building materialized out of the early haze with the quiet authority of something that has been in exactly the same place for 600 years and expects to be there for 600 more. The bronze doors were open. 2 goblin guards flanked the entrance, and they straightened as Snapchat approached, a subtle shift, the kind of posture adjustment that means this one matters. The leaky cauldron was locked and dark. The rest of Diagon Alley was shuttered and quiet, shop signs hanging still, no witches or wizards yet, just the sound of Harry's footsteps in Greenfeld's and the slightly heavier irregular beat of Snapchat's, and the morning light painting everything gold. Harry stopped outside the doors. He looked up at the building. It went up and up, stark white against the brightening sky, and at the top, carved into the stone, very old, worn by weather, was a crest that Harry didn't recognize consciously but that his body responded to, a tightening across his chest, something that felt like a word he'd forgotten he knew. He recognized the letter P. Go on, Greenfeld said, quietly. Not pushing. Just making space. Harry walked through the bronze doors. Inside, Gringotts smelled of metal and old paper and something mineral and deep, like stone a long way underground. The main hall was vast and cathedral quiet, the ceiling high and vaulted, the counters stretching away in both directions with their precise rows of goblins bent over their work. The crystal chandeliers threw light that seemed to have weight to it, golden and substantial. Most of the teller stations were unmanned at this hour. But in the center of the hall, at a counter larger than the others, more formal, flanked by 2 goblins who were very still and very alert, sat an older goblin, ancient, even by goblin standards, with a face like carved rock and a bearing that communicated, without effort, that every single thing in this building ultimately reported to him. He looked at Harry as they crossed the hall. Harry looked back. Lord Potter, the old goblin said. His voice was the sound of things being decided. I don't know what that means yet, Harry said honestly. But I'm working on it. Something moved in the old goblin's face. Not a smile, goblin faces didn't run to smiles, exactly, but an expression that was its functional equivalent. The recognition of someone who appreciates a good answer. I am Ragnarok, the goblin said. Senior account manager for the Potter estate, as I was for your father, and his father before him. He stepped down from his position behind the counter, a thing that, Greenfeld would later tell Harry, Ragnarok had done perhaps twice in living memory, and stood before Harry with a formality that felt genuine rather than ceremonial. On behalf of Gringotts Wizarding Bank, I extend our condolences for your loss, our acknowledgement of your standing, and our commitment to the obligations we undertook to your family. A pause. Your father was a good man. He was also an excellent client, which is not always the same thing. With you, I hope it will be both. Harry looked at him steadily. What did my parents leave me? Ragnarok looked at Greenfeld, then back at Harry. There might have been approval in that ancient face, or something very close to it. "Everything," he said. "But let us begin with what matters." He turned and led them toward a corridor that branched off the main hall, deeper into the bank, and Harry followed with his 3 books under his arm and his shoulder still aching and the morning light falling behind them, and ahead of him, for the first time in his life that he could identify, something that felt, quietly and without announcement, like forward. Back at number 4, Privet Drive, a second owl arrived at 7:42. It was not the soft, advisory owl of official correspondence. It was a ministry owl, large, grey, severe, and it carried a document sealed in the deep crimson wax of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, which meant it had the force of law, which meant refusing to open it had consequences. Petunia opened it at the kitchen table while Vernon stood behind her and read over her shoulder. The document was 3 pages long. The language was formal and precise and entirely unambiguous. It used phrases like formal investigation, material breach of wizarding law, custodial obligations under Clause 14, and, near the bottom of the 3rd page, in language that left no room for interpretation, mandatory appearance before the Wizengamot, Department of Magical Law Enforcement. At the bottom of the 3rd page, a single line, in slightly bolder type than the rest, "Failure to comply will result in immediate magical detainment." Vernon read it twice. His face went through several colors. "Dumbledore," he said, finally. "You call Dumbledore. He sorted it all out before, he can sort it, there's no number for him, Vernon." Petunia's voice was very flat. "There never was. He sends owls. Then we send an owl back, we don't have an owl." The kitchen was quiet. Through the window, Petunia could see Mrs. Figg walking her cats along the street, unhurried, perfectly ordinary. The morning going about its business. The neighborhood presenting its usual untroubled face. Petunia thought about Harry walking out the front door with 3 books held against his chest like they were something worth keeping. She thought about the closet door. The pencil marks. The height he'd tracked himself because no one else had. She thought about Lily. She pressed her lips together and folded the letter carefully along its original creases and said, "We need a solicitor." "We need Dumbledore," Vernon said. "We need a solicitor," Petunia said again, in a voice that closed the subject. What neither of them knew, yet, was that Albus Dumbledore had already been notified. His notification had come not from the ministry but from a monitoring charm he'd maintained on Harry's location for 6 years, a charm that had registered the activation of the Parental Protection Clause at 11:43 the previous night and had, after a pause of approximately 4 minutes, a pause that said something about Dumbledore, though different people would read that pause differently, generated an alert. Dumbledore had been awake when the alert came. He'd been sitting at his desk in his office at Hogwarts, reading a letter from a colleague in Vienna, when the small silver instrument in the corner had chimed 3 times, changed color from green to gold, and produced a thin stream of smoke that formed a symbol he recognized immediately. The Potter seal. He had sat for a moment with the letter from Vienna still in his hand, and then he had set it down, very carefully, on his desk. He'd known this was possible. He'd known since the day he placed the wards that the clause existed, had in fact read the will himself, as was his role at the time, and had noted Clause 14 with the calm certainty that it would never activate, because he would ensure Harry was never in a situation that would trigger it. He had been wrong. He sat at his desk in the blue early morning of his office, and thought about a boy in a cupboard, and about certainty, and about the gap between what a person believes they are doing and what they are actually doing, and for a while he was very still. Then he stood, straightened his robes, and began composing the letter he needed to write, choosing each word with the care of someone who knows that the words they choose right now will matter for a very long time. Meanwhile, Harry James Potter sat in a room deep inside Gringotts that was paneled in dark wood and lit by steady candlelight and smelled of old parchment and history, and listened to Arcturus Greenfeld read aloud from a will that had been waiting for him for 6 years, and felt the shape of a life he hadn't known he'd been given begin to take form around him like something solid. Outside the window of that room, because Gringotts had an underground room with a window, which was strange but entirely within keeping for a place that made its own rules, there was nothing but dark stone. Harry looked at it and didn't see darkness. He saw underground. He saw below. He saw the entire weight of everything above it, and it occurred to him, with the particular clarity of a child who has been small for a very long time, that things that exist underground are not buried. Sometimes, they are simply waiting to come up. He turned back to Greenfeld and said, "Keep reading." And Greenfeld did. Chapter 2, The Weight of a Name. The will was 47 pages long. Harry knew this because Greenfeld told him before he started reading, in the same tone someone might use to say it's going to rain later, informational, without drama. He set the document on the table between them, a stack of parchment so old the edges had gone the color of weak tea, bound with a ribbon in deep blue and gold that Greenfeld cut with a small silver knife and set aside with the care of someone handling something that had been waiting a long time. Snapchart sat in the corner with his brass instrument and his scrolls and made notes in that dark red ink, steady and unhurried, while Ragnarok stood near the door with his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't read along. He already knew what was in it. He'd been managing the Potter estate for 30 years and had been present when the will was updated 3 days before James Potter died, and there was something in his stillness that wasn't patience so much as guardianship. The quiet focus of someone keeping watch. Harry sat with his hands flat on the table and listened. James Charles Potter, it turned out, had been a great many things that Harry hadn't known about. The will established this in the careful, formal language of legal documents: Lord of the ancient and noble house of Potter, holder of 3 seats on the Wisengamot, 2 hereditary, 1 earned, a man of considerable financial standing, the last in a line that stretched back, Greenfeld noted with a brief aside that wasn't quite pride but was adjacent to it, nearly 8 centuries. There were properties: Potter Manor in Wiltshire, a townhouse in Edinburgh, a cottage in Wales that had been Lily's parents' and had been transferred to the Potter estate upon their deaths. There were vaults. Greenfeld listed them by number rather than contents, and even the numbers felt substantial. There were investments, shares in businesses, holdings in both the magical and muggle worlds that James Potter had managed with what is well described, in his own handwriting, as a stubborn refusal to watch good money do nothing. Harry listened to all of this with the same expression he wore when he was learning something new in school, not wide-eyed, not performatively impressed, just quietly taking it in, filing it, connecting it to what he already knew. What he already knew, for context, was very little. He knew his parents had died in a car crash, which was what the Dursleys had told him. He'd suspected for approximately 3 years that this was not true, because the story had always had the texture of something constructed, a story whose details stayed too consistent, as though someone had rehearsed it rather than remembered it. He knew his name. He knew, from certain involuntary remarks from Vernon over the years, that there was a world somewhere that knew who he was, though this had always been framed as a problem rather than a fact. Now the fact sat on the table in front of him, 47 pages long, and Greenfeld read it in the steady, considered way of someone who understands that the reading itself is a ceremony even if the reader doesn't make it one. The Parental Protection Clause was on page 31. Greenfeld read it in full, without paraphrasing. The language was James Potter's, which meant it was precise where it needed to be and, in places, entirely and unexpectedly human. In the event that our son is placed in circumstances inconsistent with the dignity, safety, and welfare owed to any child, and in the further event that this placement is allowed to continue by those responsible for his oversight, and here Greenfeld's voice remained even, though his eyes moved briefly to Harry's shoulder, it is our intention that the following provisions be activated without delay and without requirement of human intervention. We do not trust human intervention. We have arranged for the magic itself to intervene. They arranged for the magic itself to intervene, Harry repeated, when Greenfeld paused. Your mother's work, primarily, Greenfeld said. She was extraordinarily gifted in charm work. The triggering mechanism is tied to your own magical core. It was designed to activate the moment your accidental magic fired in genuine self-defense, because your parents determined that was the clearest possible signal that something had gone wrong that should not have been allowed to go on. Harry thought about the belt snapping in half. About the windows shuddering in their frames. About the thing that had cracked open in his chest like something that had been waiting. She knew, he said, not quite a question. She feared, Greenfeld said, carefully. She and your father both. They didn't know you'd be placed with the Dursleys specifically. That decision was made after their deaths, by Albus Dumbledore, under his authority as magical guardian of last resort. But they knew enough to be afraid of what might happen, and they built accordingly. Harry looked at the pages. At his mother's architecture, built into the law itself, built into him. What does the clause actually do? Harry asked. Specifically. Ragnock spoke from the doorway, and something about the way he did it, stepping slightly forward, as though this part was his, indicated that this was Gringotts' business now as much as legal business. 3 things, Ragnock said. First, it revokes all custodial authority over you from whatever party currently holds it, effective at the moment of triggering. Vernon and Petunia Dursley have no legal standing over you whatsoever, as of last night. Second, it transfers temporary custodial oversight to Gringotts, as the designated neutral party named in the will, until a permanent arrangement is established under your direction. Third, he paused, and the pause had weight. It formally opens a criminal inquiry with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement into the conduct of any party responsible for your welfare during the period in question. Any party, Harry said. Any party, Ragnock confirmed. The room was quiet. Harry understood what that meant. He turned it over once, carefully, and set it down. What happens to the Dursleys? That is now in the hands of the Ministry. Specifically, the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. A copy of the clause activation report, including Snapchart's verification documentation and the full 7-year magical monitoring record, was transmitted to the DMLE at 7 this morning. The monitoring record, Harry said. Snapchart looked up from his scrolls. Gringotts has maintained a passive monitoring charm on the Potter heir since the estate was placed in trust. Standard practice for noble house accounts with minor heirs. A brief pause. The record is comprehensive. Harry thought about what a comprehensive 7-year record of number 4, Privet Drive might contain, and felt something cold move through him that wasn't quite anger. It was more focused than anger. Anger was loud and hot and it scattered. What Harry felt was the opposite, a compression, a drawing in, like something getting very dense. Good, he said. Greenfeld finished the will. The last section, page 47, was a note in James's handwriting, not legal language, just handwriting, looping and slightly untidy, the writing of someone who had added this at the end and written quickly because there were things that needed to be said and time had been short. Harry, it said. If you're reading this, then something went wrong. If something went wrong, I'm sorry. Your mother and I tried. The clause was her idea originally and I improved it and we both stayed up too late the night we wrote it worrying about whether it was enough. I hope it was enough. I hope you're reading this in good circumstances, in a good place, with people who've treated you right, and the clause is just a precaution that turned out to be unnecessary. But if it's the other thing, if you're reading this because you needed it, then I want you to know that we knew. We knew you'd be extraordinary, because we knew your mother, and we knew that someone made of her kind of love doesn't produce anything small. We knew you'd figure it out eventually, whatever they did or didn't tell you. Figuring things out is also your mother, by the way. And the stubbornness is completely yours. The name means something. Not as a weight. As a foundation. Stand on it. Your father, James Greenfeld, set the last page down. Harry looked at it for a moment. Just the handwriting. The slightly untidy loops. Then he said, "Okay," in a voice that was very level, and Ragnock looked at him with those black glass eyes and something moved in them that was, Harry would think about this later, something close to respect. There is one more matter, Ragnock said. Before we proceed to the vaults. He moved to the table and produced a second scroll, this one in Gringotts red with the bank's own seal. Under wizarding law, a minor of noble house standing who has been placed under Gringotts' custodial authority may select from a list of approved magical guardians, pending Wizengamot approval. The list is as follows. He handed it to Harry. Harry looked at it. There were 4 names. He recognized one. Albus Dumbledore, he read aloud. He is on the list by virtue of his role as your magical guardian of last resort, as designated in the original custody arrangement, Ragnarok said, with the neutrality of someone professionally committed to neutrality. Harry set the scroll on the table. He put me with the Dursleys. Yes. Knowing what the house was like. We cannot speak to what he knew. Only to what occurred. Harry looked at the other 3 names. One was a ministry official he didn't know. One was a witch named Augusta Longbottom, which he also didn't know. The third was listed simply as Andromeda Tonks, née Black, approved by Potter Estate Directive. My parents chose her specifically. Harry said, pointing. She was added to the approved list by your father 3 days before his death, Ragnarok said. He made no note about why. But her name was added with some urgency, according to our records. Harry looked at the name. Then he looked at the scroll as a whole and said, is there an option where I'm my own guardian? Or as close to it as possible? Ragnarok blinked. It was a goblin blink, slow and deliberate, the kind that meant the question had registered. You are 7 years old, Snapchart said, from the corner. I'm aware, Harry said, without heat. I'm also, apparently, lord of an ancient and noble house with 3 Wisengamot seats and enough in the vaults to buy most of Diagon Alley. I'm not saying I don't need adults involved. I'm saying I'd like the adults who are involved to work for me, not the other way around. He looked at Greenfeld. Like you do. Greenfeld, who had been a magical solicitor for 26 years and had worked with everyone from nervous first-generation witches setting up simple wills to the most arrogant scions of old wizarding families, looked at Harry for a moment with an expression that suggested he was recalibrating something. That is, he said, carefully, actually the most sophisticated understanding of the clause's intent I've heard articulated, and your father, who wrote it, would have said it worse. Is it possible? We can arrange for Mrs. Tonks to act as residential guardian, meaning she fulfills the practical and legal requirements, while structuring the guardianship so that all major decisions regarding your education, estate, and welfare require your agreement. It would be unprecedented for a 7-year-old. Unprecedented doesn't mean impossible, Harry said. No, Greenfeld agreed. It doesn't. Then let's do that, Harry said, and turned to Ragnarok. Can we see the vaults now? Ragnarok looked at him for a long moment. The ancient face, with its centuries of accumulated judgment. The black glass eyes that had looked at James Potter and his father before him and who knew how many Potters before that. Yes, Ragnarok said. We can see the vaults. The cart was faster than Harry expected. It plunged into the underground tunnels with a momentum that pressed him back against his seat, and the darkness rushed past broken by the gold of Snapchart's lantern, and the air turned cold and deep and mineral, and Harry held his 3 books against his chest and felt the speed of it in his stomach and thought, this is real. He kept thinking that, actually. In fragments. This is real. That was real. This is what real feels like. The main Potter vault was the 7th door they stopped at, and it was different from the others they passed. The door was older, more ornate, etched with a pattern of interlocking PS and a climbing vine that Harry recognized from the letter P on the building outside. Snapchart opened it with a key that was already on his chain. He'd been holding it all morning, Harry realized, had been carrying it since Privet Drive, had come there specifically to bring Harry here. The door swung open. Harry had no reference point for what a large amount of money looked like. He'd never had any money. He'd had, at various points, 10 pence that he'd found on the pavement outside school and hidden in a crack in the skirting board of the cupboard until Dudley found it, and once a 50-pence piece that a teacher had given him for helping tidy up after class, which Vernon had taken on the grounds that everything Harry earned in the Dursley household belonged to the Dursley household. The vault was the size of a large church. Towers of gold coins caught the lantern light and threw it back in hundreds of directions. Stacked along one wall, behind glass cases, were objects. He could see jewelry, and what appeared to be weapons, and things he had no name for. Shelves of books lined another wall, floor to ceiling. In the center, a stone plinth held a locked chest with the Potter's seal on the lid. Harry walked in and stood in the middle of it and did not say wow or make any of the noises that a less self-contained child might have made. He said, "What's in the chest?" Snapchart said, "Personal effects. Locked to the Potter heir's magical signature. Only you can open it." Harry went to it and put his hand on the lid and felt a warmth that ran up his arm, not like the warmth from a fire or a hot water pipe, but a directed warmth, a warmth with intention, the warmth of something that had been waiting specifically for him. The lock clicked. Inside, a photograph, moving, of James and Lily Potter dancing somewhere with no one watching. "A wand, James's," Greenfeld said quietly from behind him. A letter in Lily's handwriting that Harry didn't read yet, just held. A small leather journal. A set of keys on a Potter-crested ring. And at the bottom, wrapped in a cloth so dark it seemed to eat the light around it, a cloak. Harry picked it up and it spilled across his hands like water, weightless, impossible, and when he held it up the lantern light went straight through it as though it wasn't there. "Your father's invisibility cloak," Greenfeld said, in a tone that was quiet with significance. Harry folded it carefully and put it back in the chest. He didn't take it yet. He wasn't ready for it yet. He closed the lid and stood and looked around the vault one more time. "I don't need any of this right now," he said, meaning the money, the gold. "I need to understand it. But I don't need to touch it today." "Wise," Ragnox said, from the doorway, and this time there was no ambiguity about what was in his voice. They surfaced back into the morning light of Diagon Alley to find that the alley had woken up while they were underground. Shops were open, witches and wizards moved along the cobblestones, owls crossed overhead carrying correspondence, a child ahead of them was pressing their face against the window of Madame Malkin's. The world going about its morning. Several people looked at Harry as he emerged from the bank with Ragnox and Greenfeld and Snapchart, and then looked again with the particular quality of attention that means recognition. He saw it moving through the crowd like a ripple, a catch, a double take, a leaning in. A woman with a shopping basket stopped dead and said, softly, "Merlin." Harry didn't look at her. He kept moving. Greenfeld fell into step beside him. "Word will travel fast," he said, low. "It already has, most likely." The ministry notification triggered a flag in the Prophet's alert system, completely standard. They monitor Wisengamot notifications, so there'll be a story, Harry said. "By this evening. Tomorrow at the latest." Harry thought about that for exactly as long as it took to reach the ministry car, which was still parked outside the bank's Diagon Alley entrance. "Fine," he said. "Let them write it. You're not concerned." Harry looked at him. "What they write doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change what the monitoring records show. It doesn't change the will." He paused. "Does it?" "No," Greenfeld said. "Then I'm not concerned." Inside the ministry car, while Snapchart communicated something to the driver in rapid gobbledygook, Greenfeld said, "We have an appointment at the ministry. Department of Magical Law Enforcement. They've requested your presence, not required, you're 7, they can't require it, but given the nature of the clause and the investigation, having you present would help establish the full picture." "Who will I be meeting?" "Amelia Bones. Head of the DMLE. Greenfeld straightened the cuffs of his robes with a precision that was clearly habitual. "She is, and I say this having dealt with the ministry for 2 decades, the most honest person in that building. Possibly the most honest person in magical government. She will want facts, not performances." "Good," Harry said. "I don't perform." The Ministry of Magic's visitor entrance was a telephone box on a quiet London street, which Harry found interesting, the mundaneness of it, the way the magic hid itself in the ordinary, and he thought about number 4, Privet Drive and the way normality had been used as a container for something that was very much not normal, and filed the comparison away without comment. The atrium was vast and gold and busy, witches and wizards moving in every direction, the golden fountain at the center catching the light from the enchanted ceiling. Harry walked through it with Greenfeld at his shoulder and felt the eyes following him, felt the ripple of recognition passing through the space, and didn't slow down. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement occupied the second level. They took a lift that announced each floor in a tone of complete indifference, and stepped out into a corridor that smelled of official documents and old ink, and somewhere underneath it, faint but present, the particular metallic smell of authority that Harry would later learn to associate with places where real decisions get made. Amelia Bones was not what Harry expected. He hadn't known what to expect, but whatever the shape was that he'd been building in his head from Greenfeld's description, she filled it and then exceeded it. She was a solidly built witch in her late 50s with short silver hair and a monocle that she wore not as an affectation but as an entirely practical visual aid, and she was standing in the doorway of her office when they arrived rather than sitting behind her desk, which Harry would later understand was deliberate. She'd come to meet them, not made them come to her. She looked at Harry with the monocle and without it, a quick assessment that was clearly habitual and entirely professional. Then she looked at his shoulder. The bruising was visible at the collar of his overlarge t-shirt, and her jaw tightened, just briefly, before her expression settled back into its official steadiness. "Harry," she said. "I'm Amelia Bones, head of the DMLE." She didn't say Lord Potter or Mr. Potter, just his name, direct, the way you speak to someone you're treating as a person. "I'm glad Gringotts reached out to us when they did. Come in." Her office was large but not ostentatious, a working office, covered in parchment and files, a board on one wall with various cases pinned to it in organized complexity, a window looking out onto the atrium below. She gestured to a pair of chairs in front of her desk and sat across from them rather than behind the desk, another deliberate choice. "I'm going to tell you what we know," she said, "and then I'm going to tell you what we're doing about it, and then I'd like to ask you a few questions. You don't have to answer anything you don't want to answer. You have Mr. Greenfeld here and Gringotts' representative, and you have every right to have them intervene if I ask something inappropriate." She looked at him directly. "Are those terms acceptable?" "Yes," Harry said. "Good." She opened a file on the small table beside her chair. "The Parental Protection Clause activated at 11:43 last night. By 7 this morning, Gringotts had verified the triggering event and transmitted a full monitoring report to my department. I've spent the last 3 hours reading it." She paused. "I want you to know that I have been doing this job for a long time, and this report is among the most serious documents I have read in that time." Harry looked at her steadily. "The monitoring record covers 7 years," she continued. "It documents systematic neglect, insufficient food, inadequate shelter, social isolation, the use of physical confinement as punishment. It also documents," she stopped. "Professional. Careful. It documents last night." "I know what it documents," Harry said. "Yes," Amelia said. "You do." She looked at him for a moment. "I'm sorry it wasn't acted on sooner." The room was quiet. Greenfeld was still beside Harry, and Snapchart in the corner with his scrolls, and outside the office the ordinary noise of the ministry going about its morning continued, and Harry sat in the chair that was slightly too large for him and thought about what "I'm sorry it wasn't acted on sooner" meant and what it required from him, if anything. "The monitoring charm was run by Gringotts," he said. "Not the ministry." "Correct. So the ministry didn't know." "Correct," Amelia said, and she said it with the precision of someone who is being completely honest and knows that the honesty implicates them by extension. "The monitoring was a private arrangement under the terms of the will. We were not informed. Would you have acted on it if you had been?" Amelia looked at him. The monocle caught the light. "I would have," she said, very directly. "I cannot speak for every predecessor in this role. But I would have." Harry nodded once. He believed her. He'd learned very young to read the difference between what people said and what they meant, and Amelia Bones said what she meant. He could feel the grain of it. "What happens to the Dursleys?" "They will be brought in for formal questioning today. Given the scope of the monitoring records, we have sufficient grounds for charges under both Muggle and Wizarding law. Wizarding law takes precedence given your status, but will coordinate with Muggle authorities where relevant." She paused. "The process will take some weeks. The Wisengamot will ultimately hear the formal case. This is not something that gets quietly managed." "Is there any way it could get quietly managed?" The question hung in the air. Amelia understood exactly what it was asking, not is it possible but is it likely, and who would make it happen. "There are people who will try," she said. "I intend to ensure they don't succeed." Harry looked at her for a moment longer. "Then, Albus Dumbledore is on my list of approved guardians. He placed me with the Dursleys." Amelia's expression did something complicated. Not surprise. The absence of surprise, which was its own statement. "Are you telling me, or asking me?" she said. "I'm telling you that I think that any party language in Clause 14 covers him as much as it covers the Dursleys," Harry said. "He made the decision. He was my magical guardian of last resort. He had responsibilities that the monitoring record will show were not met." "That is," Greenfeld said carefully, from beside him, "a legally sound reading of the clause." Amelia sat back in her chair. She was quiet for a long moment, and Harry could see her thinking, not the theatrical pause of someone performing deliberation, but the actual stillness of a methodical mind working through something with serious consequences. "Dumbledore will claim he had reasons," she said finally. "Strategic reasons. Related to your safety. Related to protective magic tied to your mother's sacrifice and the blood connection to your aunt. Did the blood ward stop last night from happening?" A pause. "No," Amelia said. "Then they need to make that argument to someone else," Harry said. "I'm not telling you what conclusion to reach. I'm telling you what the facts are, and the facts include who made the decision to put me there." Amelia looked at him, this 7-year-old boy in his too large clothes with bruising on his shoulder and 3 battered books in his lap, and something moved in her face that she didn't fully suppress. Not pity. Something harder than pity and more useful. "You're going to be very interesting to watch, Harry," she said. "I'm just being accurate," Harry said. That afternoon, while Greenfeld began the paperwork for the modified guardianship arrangement, Andromeda Tonks had been contacted and had responded within the hour, a reply so swift and so unequivocal that Greenfeld had raised an eyebrow at the parchment before tucking it away, and while Snapchart finalized the transfer of immediate estate management from Gringotts holding to active administration, Harry sat in a waiting room on the DMLE floor and looked at his father's letter. Not the formal will. The handwritten note at the end. He read it 3 more times. Then he folded it and put it in his pocket, close against his ribs, where it made a small solid weight against his chest. At 4:30, Greenfeld appeared in the waiting room doorway with an expression that was as close to excited as Harry suspected Greenfeld's face got. "It's done," he said. "The Dursleys have been brought in." Harry stood. "Both of them?" "Both of them. Vernon and Petunia Dursley are currently in ministry awaiting formal questioning. The charges are being drafted as we speak." He paused. "Dumbledore was also contacted this afternoon. He's been asked to present himself to the DMLE tomorrow morning." Harry picked up his books. "And the guardianship?" "Andromeda Tonks will meet you tomorrow morning. She was very clear about wanting to come immediately, but we thought today had been enough." Harry thought about that, someone wanting to come immediately. The particular quality of that, after 7 years of being something that needed to be dealt with later. "Tomorrow is fine," he said, and his voice was steady, and the steadiness was not performance. "Where would you like to stay tonight?" "We can arrange a ministry safe house or Gringotts," Harry said. Ragnarok had mentioned guest quarters, deep in the bank, old and comfortable and about as secure as anything on the planet. "I'd like to stay at Gringotts." Greenfeld nodded. "I'll arrange it." Outside the ministry building, the London evening was doing what London evenings do, going grey and golden at once, the air thick with the smell of summer and exhaust and the particular electricity of a city that never quite stops. Harry stood on the pavement and looked at the phone box they'd come out of, now just a phone box again, ordinary, giving nothing away. He thought about his mother building a trigger into magic itself. He thought about his father's handwriting. He thought about Ragnarok saying your father was a good man. He thought about the cupboard, and the belt, and the way the windows had shuttered. He had done that. 7 years old, with no training, no knowledge, no idea what he was, and the magic had answered him anyway. Had been waiting for exactly that moment, wound up and ready, and had come when he needed it. He wondered what it would do when he actually knew how to ask. He looked up at the evening sky, wide and real, wider than any ceiling he'd slept under, and thought, I am Harry James Potter. I am lord of the ancient and noble house of Potter. I have 3 Wisengamot seats and a vault the size of a church and a mother who loved me enough to build me a way out of anywhere they put me. He looked at his hands. Ordinary hands. A scar on the left palm. Stand on it, his father had written. Harry pocketed the letter, tucked his 3 books under his arm, and followed Greenfeld back toward Gringotts. The evening crowds moved around him, ordinary and unaware, and above the rooftops the first star appeared, faint and certain, and Harry walked forward under it and did not look back. Chapter 3, The hall that listens. The Wisengamot chamber was older than most of the ministry building around it. Harry knew this because Greenfeld told him on the walk down, and because you could feel it, the way the stone changed from dressed and modern to something rougher and darker as they descended the final staircase, the way the air thickened slightly, carrying the weight of centuries of decisions made in the same space. The corridor leading to the chamber doors was lit by torches that burned without smoke or flicker, a steady magical light that made everything look permanent. It was built before the ministry existed, Greenfeld said, not slowing his pace. The chamber came first. The ministry grew up around it. Which is why, he glanced at Harry, what happens in there carries a different kind of weight than what happens in the offices upstairs. Those offices can be reorganized. Redirected. This cannot. Harry looked at the doors. They were 12 feet tall, black oak banded with iron, and they had the look of something that had swung open for things both momentous and terrible, and had kept no preference between them. Who's in there? 51 Wisengamot members for a closed emergency session. Amelia Bones prosecuting on behalf of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. A ministry advocate for the Dursleys, they were provided one, as is standard, and Albus Dumbledore, who is attending in his capacity as Chief Warlock. Greenfeld paused. Which means he chairs the session. Harry looked at him. He chairs it, Harry said, but he's also a subject of the investigation. Yes. And no one finds that problematic? Greenfeld's expression managed to convey, without saying anything, that many people found it very problematic and that Amelia Bones had raised this exact point in a letter to the Minister for Magic at 7 that morning and had received a response characterized by what Greenfeld would diplomatically describe as institutional hesitation. He retains the chair until the Wisengamot votes to remove it, Greenfeld said. Which requires a 2/3 majority. And will they vote? That, Greenfeld said, depends on what happens in the next 2 hours. He pushed the doors open. The chamber was circular and deep, carved from the same dark stone as the corridor, with tiered seating rising in rings around a central floor. The seats were mostly filled, 51 wizards and witches in plum-colored robes, some ancient, some merely old, a few who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else and a few who had the particular attentiveness of people who have been waiting for exactly this. The lighting was the same smokeless torch glow, and it caught the metal fastenings on robes and the gold of official seals and the glass of monocles and spectacles. At the top of the chamber, in the chief warlock's seat, carved from a single piece of dark wood, elevated above the others, with a half-moon lectern before it, sat Albus Dumbledore. Harry had not met Dumbledore yet. He'd built an image from Vernon's occasional snarling references and from Greenfeld's careful, measured descriptions, and the image had been incomplete because images built from second-hand materials always are. Dumbledore in person was, more. Older and more, and stranger and more, and in some quality Harry couldn't name, more present than most people he'd encountered, as though he occupied slightly more space than his physical dimensions accounted for. He was looking at the doors when Harry came through them, and their eyes met across the length of the chamber, and Harry held the look without blinking or looking away and then turned his attention to the room. Amelia Bones was at a table to the left of the central floor, organized and ready, a sheaf of parchment and snapcharts monitoring scrolls stacked precisely before her. She looked up as Harry entered and gave a single short nod. Beside Harry, Greenfeld said quietly, "The central floor is yours if you choose it. You are here as a witness, not a defendant, and you are not required to sit. You can observe from the gallery if you prefer." Harry looked at the central floor. At the chair positioned there, facing up toward Dumbledore and the arc of assembled Wizengamot members. At the chains on the chair's arms that were for defendants and which, for Harry's purposes, would remain unfastened. "The floor," Harry said, and walked to it. He sat. The chamber settled around him, that particular hush that large formal spaces produce when everyone present recognizes that whatever comes next matters. He set his books on the floor beside his feet and put his hands on his knees and looked up at Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked back at him with an expression that was very controlled and very careful and behind which, Harry thought, several complicated things were happening simultaneously. "The emergency session of the Wizengamot is called to order," Dumbledore said, and his voice filled the chamber without effort, a voice built for exactly this kind of space. "The matter before us today is the activation of the Parental Protection Clause, Clause 14 of the Potter family will, pertaining to the welfare of Harry James Potter, minor, heir to the ancient and noble house of Potter. We are here to review the facts of the matter, hear submissions from all relevant parties, and determine what actions, legal, custodial, or otherwise, are required." He paused. "Madam Bones, you have the floor." Amelia stood. She did it without theater. She simply stood and began speaking, and the quality of her voice, level, factual, carrying the weight of someone who has prepared thoroughly and does not require drama to be effective, immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room. "Members of the Wizengamot," she said. "On the night of June the 3rd, at 11:43 in the evening, the Parental Protection Clause embedded in the Potter family will was activated by a triggering event at number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. The triggering mechanism, as designed by the late Lily Potter, was tied specifically to the genuine self-defense response of the heir's accidental magic. Under the terms of the clause, this activation constitutes formal evidence that the heir has been in circumstances that fall below the standard of welfare required by wizarding law, and that this situation has persisted without appropriate intervention." She turned to the first scroll. Snapchart's monitoring record, unrolled along the full length of her table, was visible even from where Harry sat. "What you have before you, or will have, as copies are being distributed, is a 7-year magical monitoring record maintained by Gringotts Wizarding Bank under the terms of the Potter Estate Trust. I have reviewed this record in full. I will summarize its contents, and then I will invite you to examine the original." She summarized them. It took 11 minutes. She did not embellish or editorialize. She read the documented facts with the precision of someone who understands that truth, stated plainly and completely, is more devastating than anything you can do to dress it up. Insufficient food, the dates, the monitoring charm's nutritional readings, the average caloric intake of Harry James Potter across 7 years compared to the legal standard for a child in his age range. Sleeping quarters, the dimensions of the cupboard under the stairs, documented with goblin precision, 4 feet by 6, with a photograph produced by one of the junior aurors that had been taken that morning. Social isolation, documented incidents of physical confinement, incidents of physical harm. And then the night of June 3rd. She read the entry from the monitoring record word for word, the goblin instrument's account of what had happened in the cupboard, time-stamped and impartial, and the chamber was absolutely silent by the time she finished. Not the silence of people being polite. The silence of people who have stopped performing their normal selves and are simply sitting with something. Harry looked at his hands. He didn't look at Dumbledore. These facts, Amelia said, establish a clear case for criminal charges against Vernon and Petunia Dursley under the Wizarding Welfare of Magical Children Act, Sections 4, 7, and 12. Both Dursleys are currently in ministry holding. The charges have been drafted and will be formally laid at the conclusion of this session, pending Wizengamot acknowledgement. She sat. Dumbledore looked out at the chamber. Thank you, Madam Bones. Before we proceed to submissions, the Wizengamot should understand the full context of Harry's placement with the Dursley family. With the chamber's permission, I would speak to this. A murmur. A vote was not required for a chief warlock to speak. He spoke. The placement of Harry Potter with his mother's sister was not made without careful consideration, Dumbledore said, and his voice had that quality Harry had noticed immediately, the voice of someone who has explained himself many times and is very good at it. When Voldemort attacked the Potters on the night of October 31, 1981, Lily Potter's sacrifice created a powerful protective magic, a magic of love, tied to the blood of her nearest living relative, her sister Petunia. For this protection to function, Harry needed to live in the home of a blood relative. Without this protection, he would have been exposed to attack by Voldemort's remaining followers from his very first night. The chamber was listening. I made the decision to place Harry with the Dursleys because the alternative, any other placement, would have cost him that protection. A single Death Eater finding him in an unprotected magical household could have ended his life before he ever had the chance to grow into the person we needed him to become. Needed him to become, said a voice from the upper tier. Everyone turned. The speaker was an older which Harry didn't recognize, sharp-faced, upright, with an expression suggesting that she had sat in a great many Wizengamot sessions and had stopped being impressed by rhetorical maneuver somewhere around 1960. She had the bearing of someone who had earned the right to interrupt. Augusta Longbottom, Greenfeld murmured, appearing briefly at Harry's shoulder. She was on your approved guardian list. The boy was needed, Augusta said, not loudly, but with a precision that carried. He was a tool, by your own language, Albus. Placed somewhere uncomfortable enough to keep him humble, I'd imagine, while also being kept alive for later use. The blood wards were not the only consideration, were they? Dumbledore's expression didn't change. Augusta, you can address me as Madam Longbottom in this chamber, Albus, as I'm sure you know. She looked down at Harry, briefly, then back at Dumbledore. The blood wards. Let us test that argument. You have just told us that protective magic required residence with a blood relative. What you have not told us is whether the magic required that the residence be a cupboard. Whether it required malnutrition. Whether it required, she stopped. Looked at her hands, just briefly. Whether it required any of what Madam Bones has just described. Dumbledore was quiet. No, he said, finally. It did not. Then the blood ward argument justifies the location, Augusta said. It does not justify what happened within it. And if you were placing a child in that location, knowing the nature of those people, under your authority as magical guardian of last resort, it was your responsibility to ensure he was safe within it. Was it not? The chamber waited. Dumbledore looked old, Harry thought. Not the controlled, deliberate age of authority, just old. The weight of the wrong answer pressing down. Yes, Dumbledore said. It was. The admission landed in the chamber the way something heavy lands in water, the impact, and then the ripples spreading out from it in all directions, and then the gradual settle into a different configuration than before. Amelia was already on her feet. Chief Warlock, given that admission, I am formally requesting that the Wizengamot consider whether the scope of this investigation should be expanded to include the conduct of the magically designated guardian. The motion is noted, Dumbledore said, and in his voice was something that Harry was learning to identify as the sound of a man trying to maintain control of a situation that has moved past his ability to control. We will proceed to a vote on the motion at the appropriate, Chief Warlock. This was a different voice. Male, older, from the right side of the chamber. Given the nature of the admission you've just made, is it appropriate for you to remain in that chair for the remainder of this session? The question was not unkind. It was almost gentle, in the way that genuinely devastating things sometimes are. Dumbledore sat with it for a moment. Harry looked up at him then, for the first time since the session had started. He looked up at this old man with his extraordinary voice and his extraordinary history, who had made a decision about a child's life with the full weight of his authority and intelligence, and who had been wrong not in his intentions but in his willingness to look at what his decision was actually doing, year after year, in a house in Little Whinging. Harry didn't feel triumphant. He wasn't sure what he felt, exactly. Something complicated and adult that he didn't have the vocabulary for yet. Dumbledore looked back at him. Blue eyes behind half-moon glasses, and in them something that was unmistakably apology, not performed, not managed, just there, direct and unadorned. Harry gave him nothing back. Not cruelty and not forgiveness. Just the look of someone who is watching carefully and drawing accurate conclusions. Dumbledore turned to the chamber. "I will recuse myself from the chair for the remainder of this session," he said. "Madam Longbottom, as the senior Wisengamot member currently present, I ask you to assume the chair for the proceedings." Augusta Longbottom stood, moved to the Chief Warlock's chair without ceremony, and sat down with the businesslike efficiency of someone who has things to get through. "Right," she said. "Let's continue." The ministry advocate for the Dursleys was a young wizard named Bodkin who had the look of someone who had been handed this particular assignment that morning and had been given a stack of notes that nobody had actually prepared properly. He stood and made his submission with the slightly desperate energy of a person arguing uphill in bad weather. He cited extenuating circumstances, he cited the Muggle status of the Dursleys and their limited understanding of magical law, he cited the difficulty of raising a child whose magic manifested unpredictably. He did not cite anything that meaningfully addressed the monitoring record. Amelia waited until he finished and then said, with a level patience, "I appreciate Mr. Bodkin's submission. The documentation before this chamber is sufficient to establish the charges regardless of the defendant's understanding of magical law. Ignorance of wizarding statute is not a defense recognized under the Wizarding Welfare Act, and the physical evidence, particularly the record for the night of June 3rd, falls within the scope of Muggle criminal law as well, which the defendants have no ignorance defense against whatsoever." Bodkin sat. Augusta looked down at Harry. "Harry," she said, and her voice was different now, still precise, still authoritative, but directed at him rather than at the chamber, and carrying something warmer underneath. "You have been offered the opportunity to speak, if you choose to. You are not required to. Nothing you say or don't say changes the facts before this chamber. But this is your session, in the truest sense, and the chair believes you should have the option." The chamber was very quiet. Harry stood. He wasn't nervous. He was aware of the 51 people arranged in a ring above him, and of the press of the old stone and the steady torchlight, and of Greenfeld at the edge of the floor, and of Amelia with her parchment, and of Dumbledore sitting now in a regular seat with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes on Harry. He was aware of all of it, and it was a great deal, and he was 7 years old, and none of it scared him. He looked up at Augusta Longbottom. Then at the chamber. He said, "I don't have a speech. A beat." He continued. "I'm not going to tell you it was terrible, because the record already does that and you've read it. I'm not going to ask you to feel sorry for me, because I don't need that." He paused, not for effect, just to make sure the next part was right. "What I want is for you to understand that this wasn't a mystery. A 7-year monitoring record isn't a mystery. At any point in those 7 years, someone with the right access to that record could have looked at it. Could have intervened. I am not saying no one cared. I think some people cared and made calculations about the caring and decided other things were more important." He glanced at Dumbledore, briefly, not unkindly. "I'm 7. I'm not going to tell you what you should have done differently. I don't know enough yet." He could feel the chamber listening, not politely, but genuinely, in the way people listen when something is being said that they recognize as real. "But I can tell you what I know. I know my parents built me a way out. They knew something might go wrong and they built a mechanism that didn't require anyone to care, because caring wasn't reliable enough for them. They built it into the magic itself. He looked at his hands, briefly, then back up. I think about that a lot. They were 21 years old and they were about to die and they were thinking about whether the magic they were building was reliable enough to protect me. He stopped. I don't have a speech. I just think you should know that. He sat. The chamber was quiet for long enough that it was its own kind of statement. Augusta cleared her throat and said, efficiently, the Wisingamot will now vote on the charges. The vote on the Dursley charges was not close. 47 in favor, 3 abstentions, 1 vote against, which was Bodkin raising his hand from habit before apparently realizing he wasn't a member and putting it down again. The charges were formally laid. Vernon and Petunia Dursley would face the Wisingamot in full session within 30 days. The vote on expanding the investigation to include Dumbledore's conduct as magical guardian of last resort passed 29 to 19, with 3 abstentions. Not the overwhelming majority that the Dursley charges had drawn, but a majority, clear and formal, and the effect of it on the room was visible, a shift in the air, a reconfiguration of something. Dumbledore accepted the outcome without objection. His face was still, and in the stillness was the particular quality of a man who has decided that fighting the outcome would cost more than accepting it, which was not the same as agreement but was, Harry thought, at least honest. The final order of business was the custodial arrangement. Greenfeld presented the modified guardianship proposal, Andromeda Tonks as residential guardian, with the extraordinary provision that the heirs' agreement was required for all major decisions. Several Wisingamot members made sounds of surprise at this. One, an older wizard with a face like a dried apple, said, "The child is 7, in a tone suggesting this was self-evidently disqualifying. The child, Augusta Longbottom said from the chair, just delivered a clearer and more substantive address to this chamber than 3/4 of the submissions I have heard in 30 years of service. The motion passes. It passed 31 to 17. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, while Greenfeld spoke quietly with 2 of the Wisingamot members who wanted clarification on the estate transfer timeline, Harry stood with his back against the stone wall and held his 3 books and looked at nothing in particular. He heard the chamber doors open and close and footsteps that he recognized, not the sound, exactly, but the particular weight and pace of them, and Dumbledore was standing a few feet away, and the corridor was otherwise empty. They looked at each other. "You handled that with a great deal of grace," Dumbledore said. "More than I deserved, perhaps." "I wasn't thinking about what you deserved," Harry said. "No. I don't expect you were." Dumbledore's voice had no performance in it at all, Harry noticed. In the chamber it had had shape and direction, the voice of a man who understood how to use sound. Here it was just his voice. Old and a little tired. "I made decisions about your life based on what I believed was best for the world, and I did not look closely enough at what it cost you. That is a failure. I don't intend to excuse it." Harry looked at him. "Are you going to try to keep being involved in what happens to me?" Dumbledore considered this honestly. I hope, to be useful to you, when and if you want that. I have information about Voldemort, about your parents, about things that will eventually become relevant to you. I would like to give you that information when you're ready for it." He paused. "I will not make decisions about your life without your knowledge again." "That's not a promise you can make," Harry said. "You don't control all the things that might require decisions." "No," Dumbledore said. "You're right. What I can promise is that I will tell you what I know and ask rather than decide." Harry thought about that. "I'll think about it," he said. Dumbledore nodded. He turned to go, and then stopped, and said, without turning back, "She would be very proud of you. Your mother. She argued with me until 3 in the morning the night we discussed the clause, because I had reservations about the legal mechanism and she felt my reservations were," a pause. "She used a more colorful phrase than I'll repeat. She was right." He walked back toward the lift. Harry watched him go and didn't say anything, and the corridor was quiet, and the torches burned their steady wordless light on the old stone walls. Greenfeld appeared at his elbow. "The Tonks meeting is confirmed for tomorrow morning. Andromeda will come to Gringotts." He looked at Harry. "How are you?" Harry thought about all of it. The chamber. The vote. Dumbledore's voice with the performance stripped out of it. The thing his father had written about standing on a name. "I'm hungry," he said. Greenfeld blinked. Then, yes. Right. Obviously. He looked mildly horrified at himself for not having managed this earlier. "There's a place in Diagon Alley, Florian Fortescue, opens until 8, very good." "What is it?" "Ice cream, primarily." Harry had never had ice cream. Or rather he'd watched Dudley have ice cream on approximately 40 separate occasions and had been given, twice, a small amount of the melted remainder in the bottom of the carton. "Yes," he said, with a feeling in his chest that was very simple and very clean. "Let's do that." They walked back through the ministry atrium, through the telephone box, out onto the London street, and the evening was fully dark now and the city was alive with it, the lit windows and the smell of restaurants and the sound of a busker somewhere playing something with strings, and Harry walked through all of it with his 3 books under his arm and Greenfeld at his side and the quiet certainty of someone who has just watched a very large thing move, and knows that more things are about to move, and is not afraid of any of them. In the Gringotts guest quarters that night, a set of rooms that were old and deep and comfortable in the way that things built without any concern for modern opinion often are, Harry lay on a bed that was a real bed, with real blankets, in a room that was a room, with a door that locked from the inside, a function he tested 3 times before he accepted it, and he looked at the ceiling and thought. He thought about the chamber. He thought about Augusta Longbottom, who had looked at him with those sharp eyes and who had said the motion passes with the confidence of someone who has been deciding things for long enough to know what matters. He thought about his mother, awake past 3 in the morning arguing about legal mechanisms with Albus Dumbledore. He thought about Ragnarok saying everything. The vault. The cloak like water. The photograph of his parents dancing. He reached into his pocket and held the letter his father had written, not reading it, just holding the paper in the dark. "Stand on it," James had written. Harry had stood on it. In a chamber older than most of the people in it, in front of 51 witches and wizards who made the rules, he had stood on it and it had not moved. He thought that James Potter, wherever he was, would not be displeased. He closed his eyes and was asleep before the thought fully finished. Chapter 4 Potter Manor. Andromeda Tonks arrived at Gringotts at 8 in the morning with her hair still damp from a shower and a tin of biscuits under one arm. Harry had been up since 6. He'd woken without an alarm, the way he always did, body trained by years of needing to be operational before the house woke up, and he'd sat at the desk in the guest quarters and read the astronomy book until the light coming under the door told him the bank's corridors were active. Then he'd gone to find Ragnarok, and Ragnarok had apparently been expecting him, because there was tea on the account manager's desk and a chair already placed at a sensible angle to it. They'd spent 2 hours going over the basics of the Potter estate, not the details, Ragnarok said, those would take months, but the architecture of it, the shape. The investments, the properties, the legal obligations that came with 3 Wisingdomot seats and a noble house designation. Ragnarok explained things with the directness of someone who had decided Harry was worth explaining things to properly, without condescension and without simplification, and Harry asked questions that made Ragnarok pause twice, which Harry filed away as a good sign. He was on his 3rd cup of tea when Snapchat knocked and said Andromeda Tonks was at the front desk. Harry followed Snapchat through the bank's back corridors, a different route from the public halls, faster and quieter, and came out near the front entrance to find a woman standing at the central counter who turned at the sound of footsteps. She was perhaps 40, with dark hair and brown eyes and a face that had the particular quality of someone who had lived through difficult things and not been diminished by them. She was dressed practically, robes but not formal ones, the kind you wore when you intended to actually move around in them. And she had the biscuit tin tucked under her arm with the ease of someone who had brought it without thinking too hard about it, because it was a simple and human thing to bring to a meeting with a child. She looked at Harry. He looked at her. "You look like your father," she said, and it came out slightly rougher than she'd intended, he could tell. Her voice had to work briefly to stay level. "Around the eyes. The rest is your mother." "People keep saying that," Harry said. "It keeps being true." She held out the biscuit tin. "I brought these. I wasn't sure, I didn't know what you'd had for breakfast or whether, anyway." She stopped. Recalibrated. She was nervous, he realized. Not afraid, just nervous, the way people are when something matters to them and they're not sure how it's going to go. Harry took the tin. It was shortbread. He opened it, took one, and said, "Ragnarok has tea. Do you want to sit down?" Her shoulders dropped very slightly with relief. "Yes," she said. "Let's sit down." They sat in Ragnarok's conference room. Ragnarok himself had tactfully stepped out, though Harry suspected he was on the other side of the wall and missing nothing, and Andromeda Tonks told Harry, with a directness he appreciated, exactly who she was and why she'd been added to the approved list. She'd known his parents. Not closely, she'd been disowned by her family before the Potter's time, had married a Muggle-born wizard named Ted and been cut out of the Black family records with the thoroughness that pure-blood families brought to their grievances. But she'd known Lily Evans before Lily became Lily Potter, had met James once at a dinner and found him, she paused here, searching for the right word, energetically present, which Harry understood immediately as a diplomatic way of saying James Potter had probably talked too much and been charming enough that no one minded. She had a daughter, Nymphadora, who was 17 and at Auror training and who apparently had strong opinions about Harry's situation, most of them expressed through a series of increasingly impassioned letters to her mother over the past 24 hours. "She wants to meet you," Andromeda said. "She'll settle down once she has. She has a lot of feelings, Dora does, and she prefers to aim them at something." "That's fine," Harry said. "The guardianship arrangement, Greenfeld explained it to me." She looked at him directly. "I want to be clear about how I see this. You need a place to live and an adult who takes legal responsibility. I can do that. I will do that, and I'll do it properly, not as a formality. But I'm not going to pretend I know better than you what you need, because I don't, and because," she stopped again. Started again. "Because the last adult who thought they knew better than everyone else what was best for Harry Potter caused this situation. So. You tell me what you need. I'll tell you if I can provide it. We'll go from there." Harry looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I want to live at Potter Manor." She blinked. "The manor's been empty for 6 years. I know. Greenfeld says it's been maintained by Gringotts estate management, there are house elves who've been keeping it up. The wards are still active." He paused. "It's mine. I'd rather live in mine than someone else's." Andromeda thought about this for about 4 seconds. "All right," she said. "Potter Manor it is. You'd live there too?" "For the legal requirement. If you want me to, yes. I do. And I'd want you to actually be there, not just technically. I have a lot to learn and not a lot of people to learn from." Something moved in her face, the same hairline fracture he'd seen in Petunia's, but this one moved towards something instead of away from it. "I can do that," she said, quietly. Harry offered her the biscuit tin. She took one. They sat in Ragnarok's conference room in the underground of Gringotts and ate shortbread in a not uncomfortable silence, which is one of the better ways to begin something. Potter Manor was in Wiltshire, in a fold of green countryside that had the particular quality of land that had been magical for so long it had stopped pretending to be anything else. The approach was a long gravel drive through old oaks, and the house at the end of it was, not what Harry had expected, though he'd had no specific expectation to be wrong about. He'd expected something grand in the way that power usually advertises itself. What he found was something grand in the way that old things are grand, not designed to impress, just built to last, and lasting, and the difference visible in every stone. It was 3 stories of pale grey stone with ivy climbing the eastern face and a roof that had settled into slight asymmetry over its centuries of existence, and the windows caught the afternoon sun and threw it back in long rectangles across the drive, and the front door was a deep burgundy red, and the whole thing looked, Harry thought, like somewhere a person could think clearly. He stood in the drive and looked at it. Andromeda stood beside him and said nothing, which he was beginning to understand was something she was good at, knowing when silence was the right thing to offer. The front door opened before they reached it. The house elf was small and ancient in the way that house elves who have served a family for generations become, not diminished but distilled, the shape of their purpose becoming cleaner and more defined over time. She wore what was clearly a Potter household uniform, a neat tea towel with the Potter crest, and she looked at Harry with enormous brown eyes that immediately went bright. "Master Harry," she said, and her voice had in it a feeling Harry couldn't name, the feeling of a word that had been waiting a very long time to be said to its right recipient. "Mipsy has been keeping the house ready. Mipsy knew you would come." "How long have you been here?" Harry asked. "Mipsy has been at Potter Manor for 62 years, Master Harry." A pause. "Since your grandfather was young." Harry looked at the door, then at Mipsy. "Can I see it?" he asked. "All of it." Mipsy's eyes got even brighter. "Mipsy would be honored," she said, and stood aside. Harry walked in. The entrance hall was high and light-filled, with a flagstone floor and a staircase sweeping up from the center, and the walls lined with portraits that, as Harry crossed the threshold, began to wake. He felt them notice him, the portraits, one by one, heads turning, and something moving through the hall like a current, a recognition passing between the painted figures on the walls. A woman in Elizabethan dress said, clearly and with great satisfaction, "A Potter." An older man in robes Harry didn't recognize murmured something that might have been agreement. And then from the portrait nearest the staircase, a man who was perhaps 30, with dark hair and light eyes and a slightly untidy look about him, who was sitting on a painted chair in a painted study with a painted grin that was exactly the kind of grin that suggested he'd been waiting for someone to show up, came a voice Harry had never heard before and recognized immediately. "Took you long enough," James Potter said. Harry stopped walking. The portrait James was watching him with the particular intensity of something that is not quite alive but is not merely paint either. The best portraits held something genuine, some echo of the person, more memory than magic but with enough magic in it to respond. He looked at Harry with the eyes Harry had seen in the photograph in the vault, and his expression was doing several things at once in the way that faces do when they have too many feelings for any single one of them to sit still. "Hi," Harry said. It was perhaps not the most eloquent thing he'd ever said, but the portrait James seemed to find it satisfying. He leaned forward in his painted chair with his elbows on his knees and said, "Look at you. You've got her eyes exactly." "I'd forgotten exactly how much," Lily always said. He stopped. Cleared his throat, which was a thing portraits apparently could do when they needed a moment. "You've been busy, I hear. The Wisengamot, Ragnarok, the whole business. Word travels fast in portrait networks." "I'm 7, Harry said. I had a lot of catching up to do." Portrait James made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something less comfortable. "You sound like her," he said. "The absolute directness. That is very much your mother." His expression settled into something quieter and more serious. "Are you all right?" "Truly." Harry thought about it. The honest version. "I will be," he said. Portrait James nodded. "That's the right answer," he said. "That's exactly the right answer." Andromeda was standing at the door, giving Harry space. Mipsy was at her elbow, already discussing practical matters in a low, efficient voice. Harry turned back to the hall, to the house around him, to the weight of it, not the heaviness of obligation but the solidity of somewhere that had been waiting for him. "Show me the library," he said to Mipsy. "Then the rest." The library had 3,000 books. Harry stood in the middle of it and turned in a slow circle and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he said, "I'm going to need more shelves." Andromeda appeared in the doorway behind him. More shelves. There are more shelves in here than in most shops. I know, Harry said, looking at the ones that were full. But I've only got 3 books and I'm planning to get more. The 3 books from Privet Drive sat on the reading table at the library center, the battered wildlife encyclopedia, the water-damaged Treasure Island, the authorless astronomy volume. They looked small and slightly shabby in the context of 3,000 books. Harry looked at them and didn't find them small at all. He put them on the nearest empty shelf, spine out, with the same care he'd give anything that had gotten him through something. That evening Andromeda made dinner. Not formally, not with ceremony, she just went to the kitchen and made food, and the kitchen at Potter Manor was vast and old-fashioned and smelled of years of cooking, and Mipsy initially appeared to help and then appeared to struggle intensely with not taking over, and Harry sat at the kitchen table and watched the negotiation between them with quiet entertainment. The food, when it arrived, was simple, roast chicken and potatoes and something green that Andromeda described as a salad but which was more accurately a collection of things from the manor's overgrown kitchen garden that had survived 6 years of minimal attention. Harry ate all of it. Every last thing on the plate, without drama or performance, simply because he was hungry and the food was good and there was enough of it. Andromeda watched this out of the corner of her eye and said nothing, which was the correct response. Tomorrow, she said, when they were nearly done, we should talk about education. The magical world has standards for children your age, and you're clearly well ahead of some of them and probably behind on others. There are tutors, can I have Greenfeld recommend one? Harry said. Someone Gringotts trusts. I don't want, I'd rather not have whoever's standard for noble house education. I want someone who'll actually teach. Andromeda looked at him. That's a very specific requirement. The standard tutors for noble house children teach them how to be noble house children, Harry said, with the clarity of someone who has spent 2 days reading everything Ragnarok handed him. I need to learn magic. Actual magic. The theory and the practice and the history. Not how to hold a fork at a formal dinner. You do eventually need to know how to hold a fork at a formal dinner. I know how to hold a fork, Harry said, holding his fork in a perfectly acceptable manner. I've been managing that fine. Andromeda pressed her lips together in a way that was suppressing something. All right, she said. Greenfeld recommends the tutor. He also, she added, needed to see a healer about his shoulder, which was still not right. Harry agreed without argument. The argument wasn't worth having and the shoulder hurt. The healer came the next morning, a small, brisk witch named Pomfrey who was apparently semi-retired from a school position but who accepted Gringotts' request without question and arrived with a bag the size of a hatbox that contained more equipment than seemed physically possible. She examined the shoulder with a thoroughness that had no softness in it but also no cruelty, just professional attention, and said things like, and yes, and 3 weeks at minimum, in the tone of someone narrating to herself. When she was done and Harry's shoulder had been treated with a poultice that smelled terrible and a charm that made the ache reduce immediately to something manageable, she looked at him for a long moment with sharp eyes. Any other injuries I should know about? She asked, in a voice that was direct without being invasive. Harry thought about it honestly. Nothing current, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Nodded. Packed her bag with the same efficiency she'd unpacked it. At the door she said, to Andromeda, I'll need to check that shoulder in a week. I'll come to you. And then, to Harry, you did the right thing, triggering that clause. Whatever happened after, you did the right thing to start it. She left. Harry looked at his shoulder. At the fading bruise, the much-reduced ache. He thought about the moment in the cupboard. The thing cracking open. He hadn't triggered the clause deliberately, the magic had responded, and the clause had been built to ride that response. His mother's work, riding his necessity. But he thought about what Pomfrey had said and found that it felt accurate, in the way that certain external descriptions of internal things can feel, like having a word handed to you for something you've been carrying unnamed. He went back to the library. He pulled the first book off the nearest shelf, A History of Magical Britain, old, densely written, and settled into the chair by the window and started reading. He was still there 3 hours later when Rita Skeeter arrived. He heard her before he saw her, a commotion at the front door, Mipsy's voice raised with a firmness that suggested the commotion had been firmly redirected, and then Andromeda appearing in the library doorway with an expression of controlled exasperation. "There is a reporter from the Daily Prophet at the gate," she said. "She's been there for 2 hours. She left twice and came back. She's written 3 notes, which Mipsy intercepted." A pause. "She appears to be very determined." "Rita Skeeter," Harry said. It wasn't a question. Greenfeld had mentioned her yesterday, in the context of word will travel fast. He set his book down. "What does she want?" "An interview, presumably." Harry thought about this. He thought about what Greenfeld had said, by this evening, the story will be out, and about the way information, once it existed, arranged itself in patterns that either served you or didn't, depending on who was doing the arranging. "Is there anything in the monitoring record that's not already part of the Wisengamot session record?" Andromeda looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The session was closed. So the details aren't public yet. But they will be, eventually. The Dursley trial will be public, and Dumbledore's investigation. Once those become public, the story comes out in whatever shape the Prophet decides to put it in." He paused. "Or it comes out in the shape I choose to tell it." "You're 7, Andromeda said. You're not giving interviews to Rita Skeeter." "I'm not going to let her interview me," Harry said. "But I could send her a statement." "Through Greenfeld. Official, legal, drafted by the solicitor's office." He looked at Andromeda. "That way the first version of the story has my name on it." She was quiet for a moment. The expression on her face was doing something complicated, the collision of he is a child and he is absolutely right producing a kind of cognitive friction that resolved, after a few seconds, into something that looked like reluctant respect. "I'll call Greenfeld," she said. The statement went out that evening. It was 3 paragraphs, legally precise, and said exactly what it needed to say: the activation of the clause, the Wisengamot session's outcome, the formal charges against the Dursleys. Nothing speculative, nothing dramatic, nothing that couldn't be verified against the official record. Signed by Arcturus Greenfeld, solicitor, Potter Estate. By the following morning, the Daily Prophet had cleared its front page. The headline was, "Harry was informed by Andromeda over breakfast," printed in the largest type the Prophet had used since Voldemort's defeat, "The boy who lived, and what they allowed to happen to him." Below it, in slightly smaller type, "Parental Protection Clause activated, Dursleys charged, Wisengamot investigation ongoing." And below that, in the smallest of the 3 lines but somehow the one that carried the most weight, "The Potter heir speaks." Andromeda read the article in full while Harry ate toast. She set it down when she was done. "Skeeter added several things that weren't in the statement," she said. "I expected that." "She described you as," Andromeda glanced back at the paper. "A small, serious child with his mother's eyes and a quality of stillness that makes you feel, despite everything, that he is going to be completely fine." Direct quote. Harry looked at his toast. "She's not wrong," he said. Andromeda folded the paper. "No," she said. "She isn't." The story changed things. Harry felt the change more than he observed it, in the days that followed, the way the world rearranged itself around a new fact, recalibrating. Owls began arriving at Potter Manor in quantities that Mipsy found challenging, from well-wishers, from people who wanted things from him, from Wisengamot members who had been in the session and felt moved to write, from children his age whose parents had clearly drafted the letters, from one very old witch who simply sent a pot of homemade jam with no note. Harry read the letters from the Wisengamot members. He didn't read the ones that wanted things from him. The jam he kept, because it was blackberry and he'd never had blackberry jam. 3 days after the Prophet's story, a letter arrived from a name he recognized, Augusta Longbottom, sealed with her personal crest, written in her characteristically unembellished hand. It contained no pleasantries. It informed him that her grandson Neville was roughly his age, that Neville had been through his own difficulties of a different character, and that if Harry was interested in meeting someone his own age who had also had a complicated start, Neville would be available that weekend and Augusta would bring him. Harry wrote back the same day, "Yes. Saturday. We'll have lunch." Andromeda raised an eyebrow at this when she saw the reply. That was fast. "I don't have any friends," Harry said, with the same factual tone he used for most things. "I should probably work on that." Most 7-year-olds don't frame friendship as something to work on. Most 7-year-olds didn't spend 6 years in a cupboard, Harry said, not bitterly, just accurately, and Andromeda absorbed this the way she absorbed most things, straight on, without flinching. Neville Longbottom arrived on Saturday in his grandmother's wake, which was the natural physics of their relationship. Augusta Longbottom created a slipstream and Neville moved in it, a round-faced, slightly uncertain boy who looked like someone waiting to find out if the place he'd arrived at was safe before deciding how to be. He shook Harry's hand with more formality than most adults, which Augusta had clearly coached him in, and then stood in the entrance hall of Potter Manor and looked at the portraits and said, involuntarily, "Oh, that's brilliant." Because the portraits, at that moment, were in the middle of what appeared to be a significant argument, 3 or 4 of them talking across their frames in the animated way that old portraits do, the painted figures leaning out of their canvases toward each other. Portrait James had apparently said something inflammatory to a stern-looking witch in a Victorian-era frame and she was making her displeasure loudly known. Harry looked at Neville, who was staring at the portraits with undisguised delight, the formality entirely gone. "They do this a lot," Harry said. "Come on, I'll show you the library." Neville liked the library even more than the portraits. He picked up the Wildlife Encyclopedia, Harry's, the battered one from Privet Drive, and looked at it with the recognition of someone who had spent time with a book exactly like it, and said, "I've got one like this at home. I look up plants mostly." "Plants? I like plants. Gran says it's not proper magical study but I like seeing how they work." He set the book down. "Your library has 3 books on magical botany and all of them are really old but probably still accurate. Plants don't change that fast." Harry looked at the shelf where Neville had already located the botany books and felt something unfamiliar and good, the particular small warmth of someone knowing immediately what they care about and you finding it interesting rather than strange. "Stay as long as you want," he said. They spent the afternoon in the library. Neville read botany. Harry read history. They talked intermittently, the easy conversation of 2 people who are comfortable in quiet but also fine without it, and Augusta and Andromeda sat in the manor's front room and had what sounded, from a distance, like a very pointed conversation about the state of the Wizengamot, and outside the windows the Wiltshire countryside went gold in the afternoon light. At one point Neville said, without looking up from his book, "My parents are in St. Mungo's. They've been there since I was a baby." Harry looked at him. "Death Eaters," Neville said. "They were Aurors and the Death Eaters, after Voldemort fell, some of them, anyway. They can't really talk. Mum gives me sweet wrappers when I visit. She doesn't know why, she just does." He said this in the voice of someone who has explained it before, who has built a container for it that lets them carry it without being crushed. "Gran doesn't like me talking about it because she thinks I'll upset myself but I'm not upset. It's true, so I say it." Harry said, "My parents were killed by Voldemort. When I was 1. Neville nodded. They sat with it for a moment, these 2 boys and the particular shape of what they shared, not the same shape but from the same war, the same darkness reaching forward into their lives and leaving marks. "Does it get easier?" Neville asked. "I know you've only just found out properly about all of it. But does it? I don't know yet," Harry said. "But I think it helps to know. Even the difficult parts. Not knowing was worse." Neville looked at him with those serious brown eyes. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I think you're right." On Sunday, the ministry sent an official inquiry about Harry's educational status, which Greenfeld handled. On Monday, a letter arrived from Gringotts, a formal one, on official letterhead, informing Harry that a member of the Wisingamot had filed a motion requesting that the Potter estate be placed under joint management pending the completion of the investigation. The motion named a proposed joint manager: Lucius Malfoy. Harry read the letter at the kitchen table while Andromeda stood beside him. He read it once, put it down, read it again. Lucius Malfoy. Who had, Greenfeld had briefed him 2 days ago, in the context of there will be people who see opportunity in this, been a Death Eater, or claimed he'd been imperiused, one or the other depending on who was doing the asking and how much gold they'd received beforehand. Who sat on the Wisingamot himself and had, by Greenfeld's accounting, more influence over its current membership than almost anyone except Dumbledore. Who had a son Harry's age named Draco, who was, apparently, being raised as the heir to a family that considered itself among the most important in magical Britain. Who was, as of Monday morning, attempting to put himself in legal authority over the Potter estate. Harry looked at the letter. Why? He asked Andromeda. Not the why of confusion but the why of someone who already suspects the answer and wants it confirmed. The Potter estate is one of the most significant in Britain, she said. If Malfoy had joint management authority over it, he'd have access to the investment records, the business holdings, the Wisingamot seats. He could use those seats to shift voting blocks. It would make him effectively the most powerful person in magical Britain's legal apparatus. She paused. And having you associated with his name wouldn't hurt his family's reputation, given what's been coming out about Death Eater activities since Voldemort's fall. He wants to use me for credibility, Harry said. And everything that comes with you, yes. Harry folded the letter. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet, something that was not anger but was colder and more considered settled into place behind his eyes. Call Greenfeld, he said. And call Ragnarok. I want both of them here tomorrow morning. He set the letter on the table between them. He filed this motion how? Through which Wisingamot procedure? Andromeda told him. Harry listened carefully. Then there's a countermotion process, he said. Greenfeld will know it. We file the countermotion before the original motion reaches a vote, which means we need to move in. He looked at Andromeda. How long does the standard motion sit before it goes to a vote? She looked at him for a moment with the expression Harry was beginning to recognize as her "You are 7 years old and I cannot get over this face." 5 working days, she said. Tuesday morning, then, Harry said. We need everything ready by Tuesday morning. Harry, he filed a legal motion, Harry said. I'm going to file a legal response. That's how it works. He looked at her steadily. I'm not hiding from this, and I'm not going to wait for adults to handle it for me. It's my estate. It's my name. Malfoy can come at it through whatever legal mechanism he wants, and I'll meet him in the same place. He paused. And I want to understand exactly how the Wisingamot votes work before that session. Every rule. Every procedure. Every person who sits in those seats and what they're likely to do. Andromeda was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down across from him and said, All right. Let me tell you what I know about Lucius Malfoy. Outside the windows of Potter Manor, the evening was settling over the countryside in long shadows and gold, and the oaks at the end of the drive stood as they had stood for centuries, patient and unimpressed by urgency, and the house itself sat in its centuries of stone and breathed. Harry listened to everything Andromeda told him and did not look afraid, because he wasn't. He was something more useful than not afraid, he was interested. He was paying attention. He was building a picture of a man who had mistaken his absence from the world for vulnerability, and was planning to demonstrate, through the most efficient legal means available, precisely how wrong that assumption was. His father's portrait, if it could have seen him in that moment, would have been extremely proud and extremely alarmed in equal measure, which was perhaps the most genuinely James Potter response possible. Harry took notes until the candles burned low, and outside the night settled over Wiltshire, and Potter Manor stood in the dark as it had always stood, quiet, patient, and entirely ready. Chapter 5, The Malfoy Gambit. Lucius Malfoy had a way of entering rooms that made the rooms feel smaller. It wasn't size, he was tall but not imposing in the way that Vernon had been imposing, which was bulk and volume and the deliberate occupation of space. Malfoy's version was something more refined and therefore more dangerous, the particular manner of someone who has never in their adult life walked into a room and felt that the room had the advantage. He wore his silver blonde hair pulled back and his robes in deep charcoal gray with silver fastenings, and he carried his cane with the ease of someone for whom it was an accessory rather than a necessity, and when he moved through the ministry atrium on Tuesday morning he did it with the practiced unhurry of someone who knows that important people are never late because time adjusts itself around them. Harry watched him from across the atrium. He'd arrived 40 minutes early, which meant he'd had time to find a position near the fountain, not hidden, just positioned, with a clear line of sight to the main entrance and the lifts. Greenfeld was at his left and Ragnarok at his right, and the three of them had the look of something that had been prepared, which was accurate. Malfoy came through the main entrance and crossed the atrium and did not look at Harry. Then he did, briefly, with the careful casualness of someone who had known exactly where Harry was standing and had been deciding how to look at him. Their eyes met for perhaps 2 seconds. Malfoy's expression did something subtle and not entirely readable, a flash of reassessment, quick and controlled, there and gone. What he'd been expecting and what was actually standing by the fountain were not quite the same thing, and Lucius Malfoy was sharp enough to notice the discrepancy and professional enough not to show it too obviously. He inclined his head, fractionally. The gesture of someone acknowledging an equal while determining whether the acknowledgement was warranted. Harry didn't return it. Not rudely. He simply looked at Malfoy with the same steady attention he gave everything, gave him exactly 2 seconds, and then turned back to Ragnarok and said, "He knows we filed the countermotion." "He knew within an hour of us filing it," Ragnarok said. "He has people in the administrative office." "Good," Harry said. "That's what I was counting on." Greenfeld made a sound that in anyone else might have been a laugh. The meeting had not been requested by Harry. It had been requested by Malfoy, formally, through the standard ministry mediation process, a request for a pre-session discussion between parties to a contested Wisengamot motion. The request was entirely within proper procedure, which was why Harry had agreed to it. He wanted to hear what Malfoy would say in person before the formal session. He wanted to see how Malfoy operated at close range, because understanding the method mattered as much as countering the motion. They met in a conference room on the 3rd level. Ministry standard, a long table, chairs, a window looking out onto a courtyard where 2 pigeons were having an argument. Malfoy arrived with 2 people Harry didn't know, a wizard in legal robes who carried the organized suffering look of a professional advocate, and a second man in ministry grey who had the air of someone whose job was to make certain kinds of things go away. Harry arrived with Greenfeld and Ragnarok. He sat first, which he'd decided on deliberately, and put his hands flat on the table and watched the others arrange themselves. Malfoy sat across from him. Up close, he was, more considered than Harry had expected. Not stupid, not blustering. The man who sat across from him now was looking at Harry with the attention of someone who had revised their expectations on the walk across the atrium and was proceeding with updated information. That was, Harry thought, more dangerous than the version that underestimated you. "Harry," Malfoy said. His voice was smooth and measured and trained, the voice of someone who had been taught young that the voice was a tool. "I appreciate you agreeing to this discussion." "Lord Potter," Greenfeld said, pleasantly. Malfoy glanced at him. Back to Harry. "Lord Potter," he amended, without visible irritation, which itself said something. "I'd hoped we might be able to reach an understanding before this matter goes to a formal vote." "I'm listening," Harry said. Malfoy settled back in his chair with the practiced ease of someone about to deliver something they've rehearsed sufficiently that it no longer sounds rehearsed. "My motion was filed in good faith, out of genuine concern for the Potter estate. A significant hereditary holding, managed by Gringotts and an outside solicitor, with the heir, yourself, not yet of age for independent governance. The estate includes 3 Wisengamot seats, active investments, several properties. It's a complex mechanism requiring experienced stewardship. Ragnock has managed the Potter estate for 30 years, Harry said. Gringotts manages the financial holdings excellently, Malfoy said, with a nod toward Ragnock that acknowledged without conceding. I'm speaking to the broader governance. The social and political dimensions. The relationships that a House of Potter's standing requires to maintain its influence. A pause. These are areas where I could offer considerable assistance. You want to help me, Harry said. I want to ensure that one of the oldest houses in Britain isn't left vulnerable at a critical moment. He leaned forward slightly. There are people who will seek to take advantage of the current situation. The investigation, the public attention, the uncertainty about your future direction. People who would use your house's standing without your knowledge or consent. He met Harry's eyes. I have experience navigating those waters. I am offering that experience. It was, Harry thought, genuinely good. The framing was careful, not I want your estate but I want to protect you from people like me, which was elegant in a way that was almost worth admiring. It identified a real concern, proposed a real solution, and buried the actual intent under enough genuine truth that it would be difficult to directly contradict without sounding paranoid. If Harry had been the frightened child Malfoy had probably been expecting when he filed the motion, it might have worked. Harry looked at him for a moment. What do you know about the Parkin investment? Malfoy blinked. Just once, just slightly. I'm sorry. The Parkin Broom Company investment. It's one of the Potter estate's holdings. 22% stake, acquired by my great-grandfather in 1923. Harry watched Malfoy's face. There's a vote coming up in the company's directorship next month. The vote will determine whether they take on a significant outside investor. If the outside investment goes through, the Potter stake is diluted from 22% to 11%. The outside investor is a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands through a Muggle shell corporation. He paused. The holding company's ultimate beneficial owner is a family trust registered in Austria. Ragnock identified it 2 days ago. The room was very quiet. Malfoy's face had gone through something during this, not a visible change, more the absence of the controlled pleasantness that had been there a moment before, replaced by a careful blankness that was itself informative. The family trust, Harry said, is called the Lux Charitable Foundation. I don't think it's particularly charitable. I think it's a vehicle for moving money in ways that are difficult to trace. He looked at Malfoy with the same steady attention he'd offered across the atrium. I think you know what it is, and I think you know who runs it, and I think the timing of your motion, filed 3 days after the Parkin vote was publicly announced, is not a coincidence. The advocate in the legal robes was looking at his parchment. The ministry man in grey was looking at the window. Malfoy was looking at Harry. Something had shifted in Malfoy's eyes, the reassessment completing itself, settling into a new configuration. Harry could see him making decisions in real time, the rapid recalculation of someone who has walked into a situation expecting one thing and found another. To Malfoy's credit, he didn't become flustered. He became still, which was more dangerous and also, Harry thought, more honest. You've done considerable research, Malfoy said. I had 3 days, Harry said. And Ragnock is very thorough. Ragnock, who had not said a word, made no particular movement. What is it you want, Lord Potter? Malfoy said. The title without prompting this time. Clearly you didn't come here to accept my offer. I came here to tell you something before the Wisengamot session, Harry said, because I thought that was the courteous thing to do. He put both hands on the table. I'm going to block your motion. I have the countermotion drafted and the votes to pass it. Greenfeld and I have spoken to enough Wisengamot members in the past 48 hours to be confident about the numbers. When the session happens, the motion fails, the estate stays under Gringotts management, and the attempted interference with the Parkin vote gets referred to Amelia Bones. He paused. Or, the motion gets withdrawn before the session, and the Parkin situation gets resolved quietly without the DMLE involved, and we don't need to be in the same room at the Wisengamot again for at least several years." Silence. The pigeons outside the window had stopped arguing. Even they seemed to be listening. "You're giving me a choice," Malfoy said. "I'm describing two outcomes," Harry said. "What you do with that information is up to you." Malfoy was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Harry with an expression that had moved past reassessment into something else, something that was, Harry thought, not entirely hostile. More like the look of someone who has been playing a game and discovered that the board has changed shape without their knowledge, and is taking a moment to appreciate the quality of the revelation even while being deeply inconvenienced by it. "You're 7 years old," Malfoy said, not as an argument, just as a fact he was apparently still processing. "Yes," Harry said. "Imagine what I'll be like at 17. It was the closest he came to showing his hand in the entire meeting. He said it not with arrogance, without heat, without performance, just as a simple forward-looking statement of fact, and it landed in the room and sat there and did not move. Malfoy's mouth did something that was not quite a smile. He stood, unhurriedly, and straightened his cuffs. "I'll need to review the motion," he said. "Of course," Harry said. "Good day, Lord Potter." "Good day, Mr. Malfoy." He left. The advocate followed. The ministry man in grey spent an additional 2 seconds in the room for reasons that were unclear, then followed them. When the door closed, Greenfeld let out a long breath that had apparently been waiting since the meeting started. "The Parkin investment," he said. "How did you, Ragnock found the connection on Sunday," Harry said. "I spent Monday reading the company filings. They're public record if you know how to access Muggle corporate registrations. Andromeda helped with the Muggle side. The Austrian trust was harder but Ragnock had contacts." Ragnock said, with the satisfaction of something that has been efficiently accomplished, "The research was not difficult once we knew what to look for." "Will he withdraw the motion?" Greenfeld asked. "Yes," Harry said. He began gathering the documents from the table, ordering them with the same care he gave everything. He doesn't want Amelia Bones looking at the Parkin business. Whatever the Lux Foundation is, it's important to him that it stays quiet. Withdrawing the motion costs him less than the alternative. And if you're wrong? If he doesn't withdraw? Harry stood and picked up his documents. "Then we go to the Wisengamot session and win the vote and refer it to the DMLE and he has a worse day than if he'd withdrawn." He looked at Greenfeld. "Either way, the motion fails. I'd rather he withdrew because then we know he understands what we found, which limits how he'll move in the future. But the outcome's the same." Greenfeld looked at Ragnock. Ragnock looked at Greenfeld. James Potter, Greenfeld said, not really to either of them, would have absolutely loved this. He would have handled it louder, Ragnock said, with some certainty. Harry allowed himself, briefly, a small smile. By 4 that afternoon, the motion was withdrawn. The withdrawal notice arrived at Greenfeld's office in the standard ministry format, a brief official form, no accompanying letter, no explanation, just the boxes checked and the signature at the bottom in Malfoy's precise and controlled hand. Greenfeld sent Harry a note via the Manners O'Leary. Harry read it, put it aside, and went back to the history of magical Britain he'd been working through. Andromeda found him there an hour later, brought tea, and said, "It worked." "Yes," Harry said. "You're not," she paused. "Most people would be pleased. Visibly pleased." "I am pleased," Harry said. He withdrew because he understood the countermove. That means he'll be more careful next time. He looked up from his book. "If I'm pleased about it and don't take it seriously, I'm not ready for the next time." Andromeda sat down across from him with her tea and looked at him for a moment. Outside the library windows the afternoon was beginning to cool, the light going from gold to amber, and the house was quiet around them. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." This is going to sound strange, but are you all right?" "Not in the clinical sense. Not in the shoulder, enough food, safe shelter sense. I mean, she looked for the word. You've been operating at a remarkable pace for someone who, a week ago, you've been moving very fast. On very big things. And I want to make sure that somewhere in there, you're also just, 7. Harry looked at her. He thought about the question seriously, which was the only way he knew how to think about things. I feel better than I've felt before, he said, carefully. I know that might not be saying much, given the baseline. But it's not just the absence of the bad things. I have the library. I have the portraits. I have Neville coming back on Saturday. I have Mipsy making breakfast with too much butter on the toast, which I actually like. He paused. I think I'm all right. I think I'm working on being all right in real time, which is different from pretending. But I'm not performing it. She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face was soft and serious at once. Your mother, she said, would say something clever here. Something that was both funny and exactly right. I'm going to say, I'm glad you're here. In this house, I mean. I think it's good for both of us. Harry looked at his tea. Yes, he said, and he meant it in the clean, simple way he was learning to mean things. I think so too. Nymphadora Tonks arrived 3 days later. She didn't come through the front door in the way that was expected. She arrived via flue in the sitting room fireplace at 11 in the morning, trailing ash and exuberance in roughly equal amounts, her hair a color that was aggressively between pink and orange in a way that suggested she'd been distracted when she changed it, and she stood in the sitting room with soot on her robes and said, Is that him? That's him, isn't it? Hello. I'm Tonks. Don't call me Nymphadora or I'll fall over something. Harry, who had been passing the sitting room doorway at that exact moment, stopped. Do you fall over things when people call you Nymphadora, or is that a general warning? Tonks pointed at him. General warning. I fall over things constantly. The name isn't the variable. She looked at him with bright eyes that were very much her mother's. You're smaller than I thought. I'm 7, Harry said. Still. Mum described you like you were. She appeared to reconsider the sentence mid-construction and veered away from wherever it was going. Anyway. I wanted to meet you. I've got 48 hours leave from training and Mum said I could come as long as I didn't. She glanced at the doorway through which Andromeda's footsteps could be heard approaching. As long as I was appropriate. Were you about to flew directly into a 7-year-old's house unannounced? Andromeda said, appearing in the doorway with an expression that had been specifically developed for Nymphadora Tonks situations. I announced it this morning, Tonks said. I left a note. The note said, coming Tuesday maybe. That's not an announcement, that's a rumor. Mum, did you track Ash onto the, I'll clean it up? Harry watched this with genuine entertainment. Tonks noticed him watching and grinned, which transformed her face entirely, the slightly defensive energy dissolving into something uncomplicated and warm. He thought, this is what it looks like when someone doesn't have any angles. Just the thing they are, directly. Come on, he said. I'll show you the library. Tonks turned out to have strong opinions about almost everything, Auror training, the state of the ministry, the correct temperature for tea, whether the portraits in the entrance hall were being rude or just continental, and the velocity of these opinions was such that spending time with her felt like standing near a friendly hurricane. She was also, Harry noticed, paying very close attention to him in between the opinion velocity, watching him with a perceptiveness that she hid under the surface noise. Her mother's eyes. She stayed 2 days. By the end of them she had taught Harry 3 Muggle card games, eaten an extraordinary amount of Mipsy's cooking, knocked over a vase and repaired it wandlessly by instinct and then stared at the repaired vase in surprise, and told Harry more about the realities of Auror training than Harry suspected she was supposed to tell a civilian, let alone a 7-year-old. On her last evening she sat on the library hearthrug with a mug of tea and said, Can I ask about the trial? The Dursleys? It's in 3 weeks, Harry said. Are you going? Harry had been thinking about this since Greenfeld mentioned the date. I don't have to go. Amelia Bones says my testimony isn't required, the monitoring record is sufficient. But I can go if I want. Do you want to? He looked at the fire. At the way it moved, constantly changing and consistently itself at once. I think I need to, he said. Not for them. For me. I want to see the end of it properly. Not read about it. Tonks nodded, looking into her mug. I'll come if you want. To sit with you. Not, I won't be in the way, yes, Harry said, before she finished. I'd like that. She looked up. That grin again. Right, she said. Good. That's settled. After Tonks left, the manor settled into its rhythm. Harry and his tutor, a spare, scholarly witch named Baines, who had been recommended by Greenfeld and who taught with the intellectual rigor of someone who had zero patience for anything less than genuine engagement and took considerable delight in having a student who matched her energy, worked mornings on the theory of magic, the principles of charm work, the history of magical development, the laws of magical interaction that underpinned every spell ever cast. Harry absorbed it with the focus of someone who had been waiting for exactly this information and had a great deal of space prepared for it. Afternoons were different. Baines had, on their second session, put her notes aside and said, "Show me what you can do already." Harry had looked at her. "I don't know how to cast anything properly." "You know how to do something," Baines said, with the certainty of someone making an informed statement. "You triggered a parental protection clause with accidental magic at 11:43 at night. You exploded a light bulb and snapped a belt in half simultaneously. That's not unfocused discharge. That was targeted." She looked at him. "You knew what you wanted to stop. The magic knew too. Show me that." Harry had sat with this for a moment. Then he'd looked at a vase on the library shelf, the same shelf where his 3 books from Privet Drive lived, and he'd thought about the belt, about the focused compression he'd felt in his chest, about the difference between wanting something to stop and directing that wanted something specific, and the vase skidded 3 inches across the shelf. Without a wand. Baines looked at the vase. Then at Harry. "Oh," she said, with the particular quality of someone revising their entire lesson plan. "Well. We're starting earlier than I thought." Over the following 2 weeks, they established that Harry could, without a wand, move objects, not large ones, not with great precision yet, but with directed intent. He could sustain a small lumos equivalent, a warm light in his palm, for 30 seconds before it faded. He could, on one occasion that surprised both of them, cause a dropped book to stop 1 inch above the floor, though he couldn't reproduce it deliberately. "This is highly unusual," Baines told him. "Most children don't have this level of intentional control over accidental magic until they have a wand. Some never develop it even then." "Why do I?" Harry asked. "I suspect," she paused, with the honest precision of a good teacher who knows the limit of their knowledge. "I suspect your magical core is exceptionally strong, and I suspect that years of not having any other way to interact with magic have made you unusually attuned to it. You've been communicating with your magic sideways for years, because that was the only channel available." She looked at him with the expression she got when something was genuinely interesting. "When you get a wand, it's going to be remarkable. Or alarming. Quite possibly both." Harry wrote this down. He wrote most things down now. The library had given him a proper journal, leather-bound with the Potter crest, and he used it the way he'd once used the cracks in the cupboard skirting board, as a place to put things so he didn't lose them. He wrote, "The magic was always there. It was just waiting for better conditions." And then he looked at it and thought that it was probably true of more than the magic, and underlined it once. The letter from Dumbledore arrived on a Thursday. It was long, 4 pages, closely written, in the sloping hand of someone who chooses words very carefully and is not quite apologizing but is doing something adjacent to it. It contained a great deal of information about Voldemort, about the night of October 31st, about the nature of the sacrifice protection and what it had done and what it had cost and what Dumbledore believed it would eventually mean. It was honest in a way that Harry could feel the effort of, the honesty of someone who has reassessed and is making a genuine attempt at transparency rather than management. It also contained this: I know that you and I are not in a position of trust at present. I don't ask for trust. I ask for the chance to be useful to you in the future, when and if you judge that useful. The information I have about your history, about what Voldemort did and why, about the nature of the magic that has been a part of your life since you were a year old, is yours. You deserve to have it. I will not withhold it as a way of maintaining leverage, because I am aware that I have spent considerable time making decisions for other people based on what I believed was best, and I am learning to do that less. Harry read the letter twice. He put it on his desk. He went to the library and did not think about it for an hour. Then he came back, sat down, and wrote a response that took him 4 drafts. The final version said, "Professor Dumbledore, I'll hear what you have to tell me. I'm not ready yet. I'll write when I am. I want it to be on my terms and my timeline. Harry Potter." He sent it with one of the Manor's owls and did not spend time after wondering if it was right. Neville came on Saturday and brought a small potted plant that he'd been growing himself, something he said was called Devil's Snare, technically classified as dangerous but which he'd been caring for since it was a seedling and insisted was quite manageable if you were patient with it. Harry put it in the corner of the library. "Won't it try to?" Andromeda began. "Not if you treat it right," Neville said, with a certainty that brooked no argument. He looked at Harry. "I've been reading about the Potter family history. Your great-great-grandfather Linfred of Stinchcombe was a potioneer. There are 4 books about him in here." "I know," Harry said. "I got to the potions shelf last week." "He discovered 12 medicinal potions," Neville said, with the reverence of someone talking about an important achievement. 12. Your family has always been extraordinary, hasn't it?" Harry looked at him. "Your gran's been on the Wisengamot for 30 years, he said. Your mum and dad were 2 of the best Aurors of their generation before they got hurt. That's extraordinary too." Neville looked at the floor. Something moved in his face, the same compression Harry recognized from the mirror, the thing that was not quite sadness but lived in the same region. "They don't remember me," Neville said. "When I visit. They don't know who I am." "I know," Harry said. "But you know who they are. And you know who you are. That doesn't go away just because they can't see it." Neville was quiet. The Devil's Snare moved slightly in the corner, a slow contemplative shift, and the afternoon light came through the library windows and the old house held them both in its stone certainty. "You're quite wise for someone who's only been a real person for 2 weeks, Neville said, finally. Harry considered this. 2 weeks and 6 years, he said. Neville thought about it and nodded. "Fair enough," he said, and they went back to their books. The Dursley trial was in 4 days. Harry knew this, of course, with the awareness of something that had been on the horizon since the first morning, the fixed point that everything else had been moving toward. He thought about Vernon's face in the doorway of the cupboard. About Petunia on the sofa, not meeting his eyes. About the feel of the belt and the windows shuttering. He thought about Tonks saying "I'll come if you want," and Amelia Bones saying "I would have acted on it," and Ragnarok saying "Your father was a good man." He thought about a boy in a cupboard counting floorboards, and about the man that boy was going to become, and about how all the things that had been done to him were going to be answered for, not by him, not with rage or revenge, but by a system that worked, on this occasion, the way it was supposed to work. By his mother's mechanism. By his father's name. By the weight of a truth that had been documented for 7 years by a goblin instrument and could not be argued away. He sat at his desk in the library of Potter Manor and opened his journal and wrote 1 line, 4 days. Then he closed it and went to dinner, because Mipsy had made something that smelled extraordinary and Andromeda was already at the table and outside the windows the evening was doing its gold-to-dark transition over the Wiltshire countryside, and he was 7 years old, and he was home, and there were things coming that needed him present and rested and ready. He sat down at the table. Accepted a plate from Mipsy with a thank you that made Mipsy's ears go slightly pink. Poured himself water. Passed the salt, he said to Andromeda. She passed it. Outside, the first stars came out. The same ones he'd seen from Privet Drive, but different from here, not smaller or larger, just owned differently. Seen from somewhere he belonged. Harry ate his dinner. Chapter 6. The Potter named the Wisengamot chamber on the morning of the Dursley trial felt different from the closed emergency session 3 weeks prior. That session had been 51 people in plum robes and the particular hush of something happening behind closed doors, contained and procedural. This was public. Every seat in the tiered gallery above the main chamber floor was filled, and the energy in the room had the charged quality of a space containing too many people all focused on the same thing. Reporters were present, visible in the upper gallery with their quick quotes quills and their careful, watchful expressions. Ministry officials Harry didn't know occupied a dedicated section to the right. And the chamber's ancient stone seemed to absorb all of it and give nothing back, impassive as it had always been. Harry arrived early again. He came with Andromeda on his left and Tonks on his right, and Tonks had managed, for the occasion, to get her hair a sober brown that lasted approximately until they walked through the chamber doors, at which point the tips went involuntarily pink, which she noticed and fixed with a slight grimace. She was in her best robes. She'd pressed them. Harry had noticed this without commenting on it. They took seats in the witness gallery, not the central floor, not this time. Harry had chosen this deliberately. He was not the defendant and not the prosecutor and not the judge. He was here to watch. To be present for the end of something. Greenfeld was below at the official table with Amelia Bones, and Ragnarok had sent a Gringotts representative to observe, a younger goblin Harry didn't know, there to ensure the estate's interests were noted in the official record. Augusta Longbottom was in her usual seat in the Wisengamot Ark, upright and still as a monument. Vernon and Petunia Dursley were brought in through the side door. Harry watched them come in. He had not seen them since the morning he walked out of number 4 with his 3 books. That morning felt at once very recent and very distant, the kind of temporal distortion that happens when a great deal of change is compressed into a short span. Vernon came first, and he looked reduced. Not physically smaller, he was still the same broad, heavy man, but there was something gone from him, the quality of unchallenged authority that he'd worn at number 4 like a second skin. In this room, in this light, surrounded by things he didn't understand and people who were not afraid of him, he looked like what he was, an ordinary man who had done a terrible thing and was now in a place where the consequences of that thing were entirely outside his control. Petunia followed. She was very pale and very upright, and she was wearing the most formal muggle dress she owned, which told Harry something about how she'd prepared for today, as though the rightness of her appearance might matter to an institution that operated on entirely different terms than anything she'd encountered before. She didn't look at the chamber as she entered. She looked at the floor, then the table in front of her, then her hands. Organized her focus into a small contained area and stayed there. She didn't look at Harry. He looked at her. Not with anger, not with satisfaction. With the same quiet attention he gave everything, and underneath it, not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but something that recognized her as a person who had made choices, which was different from seeing her as the fixed fact of a wall he'd pressed against for 6 years. She had made choices. The choices had consequences. That was just the shape of it. Vernon hadn't looked at him either. Harry turned his attention to the chamber floor. Bodkin the advocate was back, this time with a colleague, a senior witch in legal robes who had clearly been brought in to provide the gravitas that Bodkin alone could not. They sat at the defense table with organized parchment and the professional composure of people doing a job they knew was difficult. Harry did not dislike them for doing it. Someone had to. Amelia Bones stood at the prosecution table and waited for Augusta Longbottom, presiding again in the chief warlock's seat, to call the session to order. The Wisengamot is convened, Augusta said, in the tone of someone reading a clock, precise, matter of fact, not particularly interested in ceremony for its own sake. The matter before us is the formal hearing of charges laid against Vernon Dursley and Petunia Dursley, of number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, under the Wizarding Welfare of Magical Children Act, Sections 4, 7, and 12. Madam Bones, you may proceed. Amelia proceeded. She presented the case the same way she'd summarized it at the emergency session, methodically, factually, without embellishment, but in full this time. Every entry from the monitoring record, read into the official register. Every documented incident, dated and described. The nutritional records, the housing records, the incident logs. The measurement of the cupboard. The photograph that an Auror had taken of the cupboard at 6 in the morning on June the 4th, which was entered into evidence and caused an audible sound from the gallery when it was projected against the chamber's main wall, a small, dark space with a cot and a single thin blanket and a strip of daylight under a door. Harry looked at the projected image and felt nothing he hadn't already felt. He had lived in it. The image was not news to him. But he watched the chamber respond to it, the stiffening in the Wisingamot arc, the sound from the gallery, the particular quality of attention that means the room has understood something viscerally rather than intellectually, and he thought about what Greenfeld had said in the car from Privet Drive, about facts stated plainly being more powerful than anything you could do to dress them up. His mother had understood that too. She hadn't ornamented the clause. She just built it to capture truth accurately, and trusted that the truth would do the work. Bodkin's senior colleague was a witch named Hargrove, and she was considerably better than Bodkin. She stood and argued the case for the defense with the disciplined intelligence of someone who knew she was working with limited material and was deploying it as efficiently as it could be deployed. She cited the Dursleys' Muggle status, genuine ignorance of wizarding law and its requirements, inability to access the monitoring record, reasonable belief that their custodial arrangement was a private family matter. She cited letters from Muggle neighbors attesting to the Dursleys' standing in the local community, their charity work, their general reputation. She did not try to argue that the monitoring record was inaccurate. Harry noted this. She was too good a lawyer to argue against evidence that was irrefutable. When she finished, Augusta said, "Thank you, Counsel Hargrove. The Wisingamot will now consider the charges. Before we proceed to deliberation, the bench has received a request from the Potter heir to make a brief address. As this falls within the appropriate scope of the hearing, the request is granted. Lord Potter." Harry stood. The gallery noticed immediately. There was a shift in the room, not the performance of attention but the real thing, the kind of focus that arrives when something unexpected happens and everyone present simultaneously recalibrates. He was small in the chamber, the gallery was high above the floor and the chamber was large and he was 7, and he was aware of all of it and not concerned by any of it. He stood and he was still and the room was still and he began. "I want to say something about ignorance," he said, and his voice carried in the old stone the same way it had at the emergency session, without effort, as though the chamber had been built for a voice exactly like his. "Counsel Hargrove has argued that Vernon and Petunia Dursley didn't know about wizarding law. I believe that. I'm not saying they knew they were breaking a specific statute. What I'm saying is that they knew what they were doing." He looked at the defense table. Vernon was staring at the table surface. Petunia was looking at Harry now. She had found him sometime in the past few seconds and was looking at him with her hands folded in her lap and her face doing something that was not simple enough to name. "Petunia Dursley grew up alongside my mother," Harry said. "She knew what my mother was. She knew what I was. She told me my parents died in a car crash and put me in a cupboard and made sure I knew I was different in a way that was supposed to be a defect, not a gift. That wasn't ignorance of wizarding law. That was a choice about what to do with something she didn't want." He paused. "Vernon Dursley knew I was frightened of him. He used that. It wasn't ignorance. It was a decision." The chamber was absolutely silent. "I'm not asking for a particular sentence," Harry said. "That's not my place and it's not what I came here to do. I came here because I want the record to reflect that the argument of ignorance is incomplete. They didn't know the legal framework. They knew the facts on the ground, and they made decisions based on those facts. The record should say that." He looked at Augusta. "That's all." He sat. Tonks, beside him, was very still. Andromeda's hand found his and squeezed once, briefly, and then let go. The deliberation took 40 minutes. The Wisingamot retired to the side chambers in their traditional manner, plum robes moving in a collective stream through the side door, and the chamber emptied of its central figures and left the gallery and the defendants and their counsel and the observers to exist in the particular suspended quality of time that comes before a verdict. Harry went to find tea. There was an anteroom off the main corridor with a table of refreshments, and he poured himself a cup and stood near the window, a real window here, at ground level, looking out at the ministry courtyard where the pigeons had resumed their private business, and Tonks appeared beside him and poured her own cup and stood with him without saying anything for a while. "You doing all right?" she said, finally. "Yes," Harry said. "It's okay if you're not." "I know. I am, though." He looked at the pigeons. "I thought it would feel bigger. Being here." Saying that. He wasn't dissatisfied, just noticing something accurate. "It feels completed. Like a thing that needed to be said has been said and now it's done. I don't need it to feel bigger than that." Tonks was quiet for a moment. "When I was in my second year of Auror training," she said, "our instructor told us that resolution and justice aren't the same thing. Resolution is the thing you feel. Justice is the thing that happens. You can have one without the other." "Which one are you getting today?" Harry asked. She looked at her tea. "Both, I think." Weirdly enough. She glanced at him sideways. "You." Harry thought about it. The cupboard. The pencil marks on the door frame. The 3 books. The belt snapping in half. "Both," he said. Weirdly enough. The verdict was delivered without theatrics. Augusta Longbottom read it in the same level, factual voice she used for everything, as though the weight of what she was saying would carry without being pressed. "Guilty on all charges, Section 4, Section 7, Section 12. The vote had been 43 to 8, with no abstentions, which told Harry that the 8 dissenting votes had been cast not from genuine disagreement about the facts but from something political or personal or both, and he filed that information away for later. The sentencing. This was where it got complicated, because the Wizarding Welfare Act's sentencing provisions were unusual. They operated on a tiered system, penalties for first offenders operating under genuine ignorance of magical law, heavier penalties for those with knowledge. Hargrove argued, competently, for the lower tier. Amelia argued for the middle tier, which she'd indicated to Greenfeld beforehand was what she considered proportionate and achievable. What the Wisingamot delivered was this: formal magical probation for a period of 3 years, during which both Dursleys were subject to a monitoring charm, Muggle-compatible, standard ministry issue, and required to complete a supervised program on the welfare provisions of magical law. Vernon Dursley received an additional requirement, a Muggle criminal referral for the specific incident of June 3, to be handled by the appropriate Muggle authorities, which Amelia had coordinated with the relevant Muggle police service. There was no imprisonment. This was the part Harry had been most uncertain about, whether it would feel inadequate, insufficient, a system protecting itself by giving consequences that were proportionate to its own comfort rather than to what had been done. He sat with it. He thought about Amelia telling him resolution and justice aren't the same thing. No, wait, that was Tonks. He thought about what Tonks had said, and about what his mother had built, and about what the purpose of all of this was. The purpose was that it had stopped. The purpose was that it was documented and acknowledged, and that Vernon and Petunia Dursley had stood in the oldest hall of magical Britain and been found guilty and would carry that finding with them for the rest of their lives. The purpose was that Harry was sitting in the gallery of the Wisingamot chamber at Potter Manor. No, he wasn't at Potter Manor, that was later. He was here, in the gallery, in the chamber, and he was not in a cupboard. He was not in a cupboard, and he would never be in a cupboard again, and the entire legal apparatus of magical Britain had said, formally and on the record, that it should never have happened. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, considerable. He breathed out slowly, and the breath had in it the quality of something that had been held for a long time and was now, carefully, being let go. Petunia looked at him as they were let out. This time she didn't look away first. Harry held her gaze for a moment. He didn't smile and he didn't glare. He just looked, and let her see him looking, fully, without flinching, without the careful minimization he practiced for 6 years, without making himself small. He didn't know if she understood what she was seeing. He thought she might. Then she was gone, through the side door, and the chamber began to empty around him. Dumbledore was in the corridor outside. He wasn't waiting, exactly, he was standing near the far wall reading a document that may or may not have been genuinely interesting, with the particular quality of someone who has positioned themselves in a location and is occupying it without making the occupation look like positioning. But when Harry came through the chamber doors with Andromeda and Tonks, Dumbledore looked up, and the document was clearly not what he'd been thinking about. Harry stopped. Andromeda and Tonks took about 3 steps before realizing he had, and turned back. Harry looked at them briefly and they both, apparently by some unspoken agreement, found something interesting to look at that was slightly away from the current location. Harry walked toward Dumbledore. "The verdict," Dumbledore said, when Harry reached him. "Not a question. Guilty. All charges." Harry looked at him. "The investigation into your conduct, where does that stand?" Dumbledore accepted the directness without deflection. This, Harry had decided, was the version of Dumbledore he was willing to work with, the one who did not manage. "A formal censure has been recommended by the investigative panel. I have accepted it without appeal. It will be on the record permanently." He paused. "It should be." Harry looked at him for a moment. "The letter I sent. I said I'd write when I was ready. I think," he stopped. Reconsidered. Started again with the more accurate version. "I've been reading about Voldemort. What's publicly available? There's not much, and most of it's wrong or incomplete. There's a great deal that isn't publicly available," Dumbledore said, carefully. "I know. You have it." Harry kept his eyes on the old man's face. "I'm not ready for all of it. But I want to start. Not because I trust you completely, I don't, yet. But because the information is mine and I'd rather have it from the source than reconstruct it from partial records." He paused. "On my terms and my timeline. That part stands." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. In his eyes, the blue behind the half-moon glasses, the eyes of someone very old and very intelligent and, at this particular moment, genuinely uncertain of his own footing, something moved that was not performed. "On your terms," he said. "Whenever you choose." Harry nodded once. "Then, I read that you knew my mother before Hogwarts. That you were the one who told her she was a witch." "I was," Dumbledore said, and something in his voice shifted, older, quieter, less about the present moment and more about a different one entirely. "What was she like?" Harry asked. "When you met her?" Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment, this small, serious boy in the corridor outside the Wizengamot chamber, asking the question that was not about strategy or law or investigation, the question that was just human. "She was 11 years old," Dumbledore said, slowly, "and she had been doing things she had no explanation for all her life, and when I told her what she was, she didn't say I knew it or I don't believe you. She said," he stopped. Smiled, just briefly, and it was the smile of a memory rather than a performance. She said, "Are there books about it?" She wanted to read everything immediately. He looked at Harry. "You wrote in your letter that you needed the information to be on your terms and your timeline." She would have said exactly that. Harry looked at his shoes. Looked back up. "I've got her books now. 3,000 of them." "I know," Dumbledore said. She would have been insufferably delighted. There was a moment between them that was not resolved and not broken, something in the middle, a thing that had been fought over and was now in a different configuration, not at peace but not at war, something more complicated and more real than either. "I'll write," Harry said. He went back to Andromeda and Tonks. They went to lunch at Florian Fortescue's, Harry's second time, which was already better than his first purely on the grounds that he now knew what to order. Tonks got something with 3 kinds of chocolate that she maintained was a perfectly sensible choice. Andromeda got lemon, which she ate with the contained satisfaction of someone who always knows what they want. Harry got strawberry and sat in the afternoon sun of Diagon Alley and let the day be what it was. The alley was alive around them. A group of children his age were pressing against the window of Quality Quidditch Supplies arguing about broomstick models with the passionate specificity of people for whom this was the most important debate in the world. An old witch was haggling with the apothecary at a volume that suggested the haggling was as much entertainment as transaction. 2 young witches in Hogwarts robes were eating ice cream and reading simultaneously, which Harry approved of deeply. He looked at all of it, the ordinary afternoon of a world that had been going about its business while his life rearranged itself, and which would continue going about its business tomorrow and the next day, and which had space in it, somewhere, for him. He thought, I am going to know all of this. All of it. Every part of this world, and the magic in it, and the history of it, and the parts that are broken and the parts that work. I am going to learn all of it properly. He thought, I have 3,000 books and a starting point and people who are not afraid of my questions. He thought, I am 7 years old. He ate his ice cream. That evening at Potter Manor, after Tonks had gone back to Aura training trailing affection and a lingering smell of whatever she'd accidentally knocked over in the kitchen, and after Andromeda had settled in the sitting room with a book and the particular piece of someone who has had a full day and is glad to be still, Harry went to the library. He sat at the reading table. His 3 books from Privet Drive were on their shelf, spines out. The Devil's Snare was moving gently in its corner. Outside the windows the Wiltshire evening was doing its long, golden thing, the light going warm and horizontal across the grounds, catching the tops of the oak trees at the end of the drive. Portrait James was in a small portrait that Harry had moved from the entrance hall to the library, which the other portraits had opinions about but which James had been vocally in favor of. He was reading a painted book and not quite managing to pretend he wasn't watching Harry. Harry opened his journal. He looked at what he'd written 3 weeks ago, 4 days. He turned to a new page. He wrote, "The trial is done. Guilty on all charges. The record reflects the truth. That is what the clause was built to do, and it did it." He stopped. Looked at what he'd written. Added, "Mum built the mechanism. Dad wrote the letter. They were 21 years old and about to die and they were thinking about me." Another stop. "I have been thinking about what it means to carry a name. Not as a weight. As a foundation. Dad said to stand on it and I have been standing on it and it has not moved." He looked up at the portrait. James was definitely not reading his book. He was watching Harry with an expression that was trying very hard to be casual. "Stop pretending to read," Harry said. Portrait James closed the painted book with the dignity of someone who had absolutely been reading and had chosen to stop. "How was it?" "Completed," Harry said. "Like something that needed to finish has finished." "And Dumbledore?" "We talked. I'm going to hear what he knows, eventually. When I'm ready." Harry looked at the portrait steadily. "He told me about Mum. When she found out she was a witch. That she wanted to read everything immediately." Something in Portrait James's face went very still, and then very warm, the two together in the particular combination of things that hurt and things that matter and the impossibility of separating them. "She was like that about everything," he said. "You'd tell her something new and she'd immediately want to know all of it, the whole shape of it. She'd read until, we'd have to," he stopped. His painted hands shifted on the painted book. "She'd have been here every day, you know. If she could be. In this room. Reading everything and telling you about all of it." Harry looked at the shelf with the 3 books from Privet Drive. "I know," he said. The quiet held for a moment. Then Portrait James said, in a different tone, the one Harry had started to recognize as the one he used when he was about to say something he thought was important and was trying to not make it too heavy, the Malfoy situation. You handled that. We handled it. Ragnarok and Greenfeld and Andromeda. Don't do that, Portrait James said. Don't redistribute credit as a reflex. You found the connection. You set the meeting. You gave him the two options and you were calm enough that he believed you meant both of them. He looked at Harry. That was you. Take it. Harry considered this. All right, he said. That was me. Better. Portrait James leaned back in his chair. He'll come back, you know. Not immediately. But Lucius Malfoy doesn't lose a round and decide to play a different game. He just plays the same game from a different angle. I know, Harry said. I'll be more prepared next time. You were remarkably prepared this time, considering you're 7. You keep saying I'm 7 like it's a complication, Harry said. It's an observation. It's a fact that's going to stop being true in less than a year, Harry said. And then the year after that. I'm going to keep getting older and knowing more and having more of the estate under my actual direction. Every year, Malfoy has less of an argument and I have more. He looked at the journal. Time is on my side. I just have to not make large mistakes in the meantime. Portrait James looked at him for a long moment. The painted light of the portrait study caught the planes of his face, and Harry could see, in the angle of the jaw and the particular set of the eyes when the expression dropped away, the person he was going to grow into. Your mother, Portrait James said, argued with me about long-term strategy constantly. She could hold a 15-year plan in her head and tell you exactly which present action affected which future variable. I was always the immediate decision person. She was the architecture. He paused. You're the architecture. You know that? I'm learning to be, Harry said. No, Portrait James said, firmly. You are. Already. You were doing it in the Wisengamot session at 7 years old in clothes that didn't fit, and you were doing it with Malfoy across a ministry conference table, and you're doing it right now, sitting in your library planning for the next 10 years. His voice had in it the rough quality it got when the emotion was real. I just want you to know that I see it. In case it matters that I see it. Harry looked at the journal in his hands. The leather cover, the Potter crest. His father's handwriting on the page he'd memorized, the name means something, not as a weight, as a foundation, stand on it. It matters, Harry said. Simply, directly, without flinching from it. It matters that you see it. They were quiet together, the boy and the portrait of the father, in the library of a house that had been empty for 6 years and was not empty anymore, while outside the Wiltshire evening finished its long golden passage into dark. After a while Harry wrote in his journal for another hour, notes from that day, things to follow up with Ragnarok, questions for Baines on Wednesday morning, a list of the books on the history of magical law that he'd identified as relevant to understanding the Wisengamot's procedural rules. He wrote, at the bottom of the page, almost as a footnote, things I have now, a house, a name, 3,000 books, a vault, a guardian who is genuinely present, a friend called Neville who likes plants, a goblin who respected my father and has chosen to respect me, a solicitor who does what I ask and tells me when I'm wrong, a woman who comes through fireplaces and falls over things and means everything she says. A portrait who watches me read. He looked at the list. Added one more line, it's a foundation. He closed the journal and put it on the desk and looked at the portrait one more time. Portrait James had fallen asleep in his painted chair, or was performing sleep, which with portraits was sometimes the same thing. His face was relaxed in a way that Harry recognized from the photograph in the vault, the photograph of him dancing, the face of someone in a good moment and knowing it. Harry turned off the lights in the library, the new way, the way Baines had been teaching him, a clean directed thought and the lamps dimming in sequence, and the room went to moonlight, silver through the tall windows, and the books stood in their thousands on their shelves, and the devil's snare moved once in its corner and stilled. He walked upstairs to his room. A real room, with a door that locked from the inside. He checked the lock, because he still did that, and was not yet ready to stop, and had decided not to require himself to be ready yet. He got into bed. He looked at the ceiling, plaster, old, with a small water stain in the far corner that Mipsy considered a personal affront, and he thought about nothing in particular, which was different from the nothing he'd thought about in the cupboard, different in every quality and texture, a nothing that had space in it, that opened out in all directions. He thought about Hogwarts, which was 4 years away. He thought about what Baines said would happen when he got a wand, remarkable, or alarming, quite possibly both. He thought about Neville and his devil's snare and his 4 books on botany and the steady, serious way he had of caring about things. He thought about Malfoy's face across the ministry conference table, the moment the reassessment completed. Imagine what I'll be like at 17. He'd meant it. He could feel the shape of it, the long architecture of it, the person who was going to walk into Hogwarts in 4 years having had 4 years of Baines and Ragnarok and 3,000 books and the Potter family portraits and all the things he was building every day in the library and the practice sessions and the Tuesday mornings going over estate management with Greenfeld. He thought about his mother awake past 3 in the morning arguing about legal mechanisms, and about that argument being the reason he was lying in this bed in this room in this house with this ceiling. He thought about what it meant to be loved by people who had loved you so specifically, so practically, so structurally, who had loved you by thinking carefully about what you might need when they were gone and building it in, wiring it into the magic itself. He held that. He thought, I am Harry James Potter, Lord of the ancient and noble house of Potter. Heir to 3,000 books and a vault the size of a church and a name that is 800 years old and a mother who built a way out of anywhere and a father who said the name is a foundation. He thought, I am 7 years old. I have a great deal still to learn and I am going to learn all of it. He thought, I am not afraid of any of it. And Harry Potter, in the room that was his, in the house that was his, in the life that was his, closed his eyes and slept deeply and without interruption, and outside the windows of Potter Manor the Wiltshire night turned and the stars moved in their ancient courses, and the house stood in its stone certainty, patient and permanent, exactly as it had always been, waiting not for someone to inherit it but for someone to come home. He was home.